A brilliant diplomat finds himself unemployed overnight when his government falls. Desperate to regain relevance, he writes a short handbook on political power as a job application. 5 centuries later, that handbook has shaped the minds of revolutionaries and tyrants, presidents and prime ministers, business leaders and military strategists. The author died believing himself a failure, never knowing he had created the most influential work of political analysis ever written. Niccolò Machiavelli did not intend to become the most misunderstood and controversial political thinker in history. He simply refused to accept the comfortable lies that political theory had been telling for over 1,000 years. Where others saw moral instruction and philosophical idealism, he saw practical problems requiring practical solutions. Where others preached about how the world should work, he observed relentlessly how it actually does work. This shift from normative theory to empirical analysis fundamentally transformed political thought and created the foundation for modern political science. But it also made him the most feared name in political philosophy, a man whose insights were too dangerous to ignore and too uncomfortable to embrace. Part 1. The Effectual Truth Revolution. The entire edifice of Machiavellian political philosophy rests on a single devastating methodological innovation. Previous political theorists had focused on what Machiavelli called the imagined truth, elaborate philosophical constructions about ideal governments ruled by perfect princes guided by divine wisdom. Machiavelli announced his intention to pursue something completely different, something he called the effectual truth. He would study how political power actually operates in the real world, regardless of how uncomfortable or morally challenging those observations might prove. This methodological revolution emerged from Machiavelli's professional experience as a senior civil servant in the Florentine Republic. For 14 years, from 1498 to 1512, he served as second chancellor and secretary to the Ten of War. This position required him to conduct diplomatic missions throughout Italy and beyond, negotiate with kings and generals, organize military campaigns, and manage complex domestic political crises. Unlike philosophers who theorized about politics from university libraries, Machiavelli learned about power by wielding it directly. What he observed during those years shattered every comfortable assumption about political leadership that had dominated Western thought since Augustine and Aquinas. The most morally upright rulers frequently lost their kingdoms to more ruthless competitors. Leaders who followed traditional Christian virtues of mercy, forgiveness and trust often presided over disasters that destroyed thousands of lives. Meanwhile, cunning and occasionally brutal rulers secured peace, prosperity and stability for their subjects. The conventional wisdom that linked moral goodness with political effectiveness proved not merely wrong, but dangerously wrong. Good people made terrible rulers when they remained good in traditionally understood ways. Consider the case of Piero Soderini, the head of the Florentine Republic during much of Machiavelli's tenure. Soderini embodied traditional political virtue in every conceivable way. He was honest, merciful, trusting and committed to constitutional procedures and legal precedent. He treated political opponents with fairness and gave them multiple opportunities to prove their loyalty. When faced with dangerous conspiracies, he chose patience and persuasion over decisive action. The result was catastrophic. His enemies exploited his goodness systematically, eventually destroying both him and the republic he had tried so hard to preserve. Soderini's virtue became his fatal weakness, and his people paid the price for his moral consistency. This pattern repeated itself throughout Italian politics during Machiavelli's lifetime. The Italian peninsula had become a battleground where French, Spanish and German armies fought for control, while native rulers proved incapable of effective resistance. Traditional political theory offered no useful guidance for leaders facing such unprecedented challenges. Philosophers could explain why rulers should be just and merciful, but they could not explain how to prevent foreign conquest or domestic revolution. The gap between theoretical wisdom and practical necessity had become so vast that political theory risked becoming completely irrelevant to actual governance. Machiavelli resolved to close that gap by developing an entirely new approach to political analysis. The effectual truth methodology required systematic observation of successful political actors, regardless of their moral status. Machiavelli studied ancient examples like Moses, Cyrus, Romulus and Theseus, alongside contemporary figures like Cesare Borgia and Ferdinand of Aragon. He asked not whether these leaders were good people, but whether they achieved their political objectives effectively. What strategies did they use to acquire power, maintain power and expand power? How did they handle domestic opposition, foreign threats and unexpected crises? What personal qualities enabled them to succeed where others failed? These empirical questions generated insights that would revolutionize political thought and create the intellectual foundation for modern statecraft. But they also generated conclusions that scandalized traditional moralists and made Machiavelli's name synonymous with political evil. The methodological shift from imagined truth to effectual truth created what scholars now recognize as the birth of political science as a distinct discipline. Before Machiavelli, political theory remained a branch of moral philosophy or theology, focused primarily on ethical instruction and spiritual edification. After Machiavelli, serious political analysis required empirical observation, hypothesis testing, and theoretical frameworks that could predict and explain actual political behavior. This transformation made possible everything from modern international relations theory to contemporary studies of electoral behavior and institutional design. But it also created an intellectual crisis that continues to this day. If political effectiveness requires abandoning traditional moral constraints, what happens to the relationship between power and justice? Machiavelli opened this question but never fully resolved it, leaving subsequent generations to struggle with the tension between political realism and moral idealism. Part 2. The Psychological Architecture of Political Animals. Machiavelli constructed his entire political philosophy on a foundation of systematic psychological observation that would not be matched in rigor until the emergence of experimental psychology 4 centuries later. His analysis of human nature went far beyond simple cynicism or misanthropy to develop a sophisticated understanding of how cognitive biases, emotional drives and social pressures shape political behavior. This psychological realism became the bedrock of all subsequent Machiavellian analysis, making it essential to understand exactly what he discovered about the human mind and how those discoveries informed his political prescriptions. Modern behavioral economics and political psychology have largely confirmed his core insights about human decision-making under pressure. The centerpiece of Machiavellian psychology is his theory of what we might call conditional loyalty. Humans are not inherently evil or inherently good, but rather inherently self-interested and fundamentally responsive to immediate environmental pressures. People will behave virtuously when virtue serves their interests, and they will behave badly when circumstances make bad behavior advantageous. This means that human behavior is largely predictable if you understand the incentive structures, and psychological pressures operating in any given situation. Most importantly, it means that creating good behavior requires designing institutions and policies that make good behavior personally beneficial rather than personally costly. Moral exhortation alone will always fail because it asks people to act against their perceived self-interest. Machiavelli identified several specific cognitive biases that make humans particularly unsuitable for traditional moral politics. First, people consistently prioritize immediate rewards over long-term benefits, even when the long-term benefits are objectively larger and more important. This temporal discounting makes it nearly impossible for leaders to build support for policies that require short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. Citizens will vote against infrastructure spending that would benefit them enormously in 20 years if it requires higher taxes today. They will support military adventures that feel satisfying immediately, even when those adventures create devastating long-term consequences. Political leaders who ignore this bias and appeal to long-term thinking will consistently lose to demagogues who promise immediate gratification. Second, humans demonstrate what Machiavelli called ingratitude, but what modern psychology recognizes as the hedonic treadmill and baseline adjustment. People quickly adapt to improved circumstances and begin taking those improvements for granted. A leader who provides peace and prosperity will find that citizens soon forget the previous chaos and begin complaining about minor inconveniences. Meanwhile, any temporary setback will be blamed entirely on current leadership, regardless of underlying structural causes. This creates a systematic bias against competent but uncharismatic leaders and in favor of dynamic personalities who promise dramatic change. The psychological mechanism that helped humans survive in unstable prehistoric environments becomes a major obstacle to effective governance in complex modern societies. Third, humans exhibit severe overconfidence bias when evaluating their own capabilities and judgment. Most people believe they are above-average drivers, above-average lovers, and above-average judges of character. In political contexts, this translates into citizens who believe they can easily distinguish between honest and dishonest politicians, between realistic and unrealistic policy proposals, between competent and incompetent leadership. This overconfidence makes democratic publics vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation by skilled demagogues who understand how to exploit cognitive weaknesses. It also makes them resistant to expert advice and technical knowledge when that expertise conflicts with their intuitive judgments. Leaders who acknowledge this bias and design their communication strategies accordingly will be more successful than those who assume rational deliberation will prevail. Fourth, Machiavelli observed that humans are fundamentally imitative creatures who take their behavioral cues from social environments rather than abstract principles. People want to fit in with their peer groups more than they want to be morally consistent. This means that moral behavior depends heavily on social expectations and visible enforcement mechanisms rather than on internal character development. When corruption becomes normalized in a political system, even initially honest people will begin engaging in corrupt behavior to avoid social isolation. Conversely, when institutional cultures maintain high standards and consistent enforcement, people will behave ethically even when they might prefer to cheat. This insight leads directly to Machiavelli's emphasis on institutional design and legal frameworks rather than moral education as the foundation of good government. Finally, Machiavelli identified what modern psychology calls the fundamental attribution error in political contexts. When bad things happen to them, people blame external circumstances and bad luck. When bad things happen to others, people blame character flaws and poor decision-making. This asymmetry makes it nearly impossible for political leaders to maintain credibility during difficult periods. Citizens will attribute economic downturns, natural disasters, and international crises to leadership failures even when those events result from factors completely beyond governmental control. Meanwhile, they will attribute their personal successes to their own virtues, even when those successes result primarily from favourable social and economic conditions created by effective governance. Understanding this bias helps explain why competent leaders often lose elections during temporary crises, while incompetent leaders sometimes maintain popularity during periods of inherited prosperity. It also explains why successful political leadership requires not just good policy making, but sophisticated management of public psychology and media narratives. Part 3. Virtue versus Virtue, the revolutionary redefinition of excellence. No concept in Machiavellian philosophy has generated more confusion and controversy than his radical redefinition of virtue, the Italian word that sounds like virtue but means something fundamentally different and far more complex. Traditional virtue, as understood by Christian moral theology and classical philosophy, involved the consistent practice of moral goodness, regardless of consequences. Machiavellian virtue involves the flexible deployment of whatever qualities and strategies prove necessary for achieving political objectives in specific circumstances. This distinction represents perhaps the most profound break with traditional Western political thought, creating a new framework for evaluating political leadership that prioritizes effectiveness over moral consistency. Classical virtue emphasized 4 cardinal qualities that remained constant across all situations and contexts. Prudence meant making decisions based on moral wisdom and long-term spiritual consequences. Justice meant treating all people according to universal moral principles, regardless of political convenience. Fortitude meant maintaining moral courage even when virtue required personal sacrifice or political disadvantage. Temperance meant moderating all appetites and desires according to rational moral guidelines. These qualities were supposed to create reliable, predictable, and morally admirable behavior that would inspire others to similar virtue. The assumption underlying classical virtue was that moral goodness and political effectiveness would ultimately align because the universe was structured according to divine justice. Good people would eventually succeed and evil people would eventually fail because cosmic order favored righteousness. Machiavellian virtue operates according to completely different principles that reflect empirical observation rather than theological hope. The core principle is situational appropriateness rather than moral consistency. A leader with virtue can be generous when generosity advances political objectives, and ruthless when ruthlessness becomes necessary. They can be honest when honesty builds useful relationships, and deceptive when deception prevents greater harm. They can be patient when patience allows superior positioning, and decisive when delay creates dangerous vulnerabilities. This flexibility requires extraordinary psychological sophistication because it demands constant evaluation of changing circumstances and adaptive responses to new challenges. The psychological requirements for virtue go far beyond simple moral flexibility or ethical relativism. First, leaders must develop what Machiavelli called an accurate understanding of the nature of men. This means seeing people as they actually are, rather than as we wish they were, or as moral theory says they should be. Most political failures result from leaders who project their own values onto other people and assume that others share their motivations and priorities. Effective leaders understand that different people respond to different incentives, and that successful motivation requires matching strategies to specific psychological profiles. This demands sophisticated emotional intelligence and the ability to suppress personal preferences in favor of strategic calculations. Second, virtue requires what we might call temporal flexibility in moral reasoning. Traditional virtue operates according to universal principles that apply equally across all time periods and circumstances. Virtue operates according to contextual analysis that evaluates the specific requirements of particular moments and situations. Sometimes the situation requires immediate decisive action, even when that action violates normal procedural safeguards. Sometimes the situation requires patient long-term planning, even when public pressure demands immediate visible responses. Sometimes the situation requires dramatic public displays of power, even when private negotiation would be more personally comfortable. Leaders with virtue can distinguish between these different situational requirements and adjust their behavior accordingly, rather than defaulting to habitual responses. This temporal sensitivity allows them to seize opportunities that less flexible leaders miss and avoid traps that catch more predictable opponents. Third, virtue demands the psychological ability to compartmentalize different moral systems for different spheres of activity. A leader might practice traditional Christian virtue in their personal relationships while employing completely different standards in their political responsibilities. This compartmentalization should not be confused with simple hypocrisy or moral relativism. Instead, it reflects recognition that different social roles involve different moral obligations, and that these obligations sometimes conflict with each other. The moral standards appropriate for family relationships may be completely inappropriate for international diplomacy. The level of trust and forgiveness suitable for personal friendships may be dangerous when applied to political opponents who are actively seeking to destroy you. Leaders with virtue can navigate these different moral systems without becoming paralyzed by cognitive dissonance or abandoning moral reasoning altogether. They maintain moral seriousness while adapting their moral frameworks to fit their functional responsibilities. The most sophisticated aspect of Machiavellian virtue involves what he called knowing the nature of the times. Different historical periods reward different leadership qualities and punish different leadership weaknesses. During periods of stability and prosperity, leaders who emphasize consensus building, institutional respect and gradual reform will be most successful. During periods of crisis and upheaval, leaders who can act decisively, break institutional constraints and impose new orders will be most effective. The tragic irony is that leaders who develop virtue appropriate for one type of period often cannot adapt successfully when historical circumstances change. This explains why many successful wartime leaders fail during peacetime reconstruction, and why many effective peacetime leaders prove inadequate during national emergencies. True virtue would require the almost superhuman ability to reinvent oneself completely as circumstances demand, maintaining psychological coherence while fundamentally altering one's leadership approach. Machiavelli believed that such complete adaptability was theoretically possible but practically very rare, which helps explain why political leadership is so difficult and why truly great leaders appear so infrequently in history. Part 4. Fortune, Contingency, and the Limits of Human Control. Machiavelli's analysis of fortune represents one of the most sophisticated treatments of randomness, contingency, and uncertainty in the history of political thought. Modern decision theory, game theory, and risk management have largely confirmed his insights about operating effectively under conditions of radical uncertainty. His metaphors for fortune have become embedded in strategic thinking across multiple disciplines, from military planning to business management to personal development. But the deeper philosophical implications of his fortune analysis remain poorly understood and continue to generate interpretive controversies among scholars. The traditional medieval understanding of fortune treated it as either divine providence working through apparently random events, or as a moral testing mechanism that rewarded virtue and punished vice over time. Good people would eventually experience good fortune, and evil people would eventually face destructive consequences. This providential interpretation made fortune essentially predictable in the long run, even if specific timing remained mysterious. It also made fortune morally meaningful, since apparent randomness actually reflected deeper spiritual patterns that human reason could not fully comprehend. Political leaders operating under this framework could assume that virtue would eventually be rewarded, and that temporary setbacks reflected either divine testing or insufficient moral development. This created a relatively stable psychological foundation for political action, since leaders could maintain confidence that moral behavior would ultimately lead to political success. Machiavellian fortune operates according to completely different principles that reflect his commitment to empirical observation rather than theological assumption. Fortune is genuinely random, genuinely powerful, and genuinely indifferent to human moral categories. Good people experience terrible luck, and evil people sometimes prosper through pure chance. This randomness is not a temporary appearance masking deeper providential order, but rather a fundamental feature of political reality that leaders must acknowledge and accommodate. The universe does not care about human political projects, and will not adjust natural disasters, economic cycles, or international conflicts to reward virtue or punish vice. This means that political success requires developing strategies that can survive and exploit random events, rather than assuming that good intentions will generate favorable circumstances. Machiavelli's famous river metaphor illustrates both the power and the limitations of fortune in political affairs. Fortune resembles a violent river that floods unpredictably, destroying everything in its path and appearing completely unstoppable when it rages. But during calm periods, intelligent people can build dikes, channels and barriers that will control future floods and direct the river's power toward useful purposes. The metaphor captures several crucial insights about the relationship between human agency and environmental constraints. First, preparation during good times determines survival during bad times. Leaders who assume that current stability will continue indefinitely will be overwhelmed when circumstances change suddenly. Second, you cannot stop or control fortune directly, but you can influence how fortune affects you through advanced planning and institutional design. Third, the same environmental forces that destroy unprepared people can be harnessed to benefit those who understand how to work with natural patterns rather than against them. The gendered dimension of Machiavelli's fortune analysis reflects Renaissance assumptions about psychology and power that modern readers often find troubling. He personified fortune as a woman who responds favorably to bold, aggressive, and even violent approaches from young men. While the specific gender metaphors reflect outdated cultural assumptions, the underlying psychological insight remains valuable for understanding risk-taking and opportunity recognition. Fortune favors leaders who can act decisively under uncertainty, rather than those who wait for perfect information before making decisions. It rewards those who are willing to take calculated risks rather than those who prioritize safety and predictability above all other considerations. Most importantly, It advantages those who maintain psychological resilience and adaptive capacity during periods of rapid change rather than those who become paralyzed by complexity and ambiguity. The practical implications of Machiavellian fortune analysis extend far beyond metaphorical speculation to generate specific strategic recommendations that remain relevant across different historical periods and political contexts. First, leaders should diversify their sources of power, legitimacy and support so that random events cannot destroy their entire political foundation simultaneously. Second, they should maintain strategic reserves of resources, energy and political capital that can be deployed rapidly when unexpected opportunities or crises emerge. Third, they should develop multiple contingency plans for different possible futures rather than assuming that current trends will continue indefinitely. Fourth, they should cultivate psychological flexibility and emotional resilience so that they can adapt quickly to changing circumstances without becoming paralyzed by stress or nostalgia for previous conditions. Fifth, they should build institutional systems that can function effectively under different leadership styles and environmental conditions rather than depending entirely on their personal qualities and preferences. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli's fortune analysis provides a framework for understanding the relationship between individual agency and structural constraints that avoids both naive optimism and paralyzing pessimism. Leaders cannot control fortune, but they can influence their relationship with fortune through preparation, adaptability, and strategic thinking. This creates space for meaningful human action without generating unrealistic expectations about what political leadership can accomplish. It also helps explain why leadership success depends not just on personal virtues or technical skills, but on the complex interaction between individual qualities and historical circumstances that no one can fully predict or control. Understanding this interaction makes it possible to evaluate political performance more accurately and to develop more realistic expectations about what effective governance can achieve under different conditions. It also provides psychological resources for maintaining hope and agency during difficult periods without falling into the trap of assuming that good intentions alone will generate favorable outcomes. Part 5. The Princely Arts versus Republican Sciences. The relationship between Machiavelli's two major political works, The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, reveals a sophisticated understanding of how different political systems require fundamentally different leadership approaches, institutional designs, and citizen capabilities. Most readers know only The Prince and assume that Machiavelli favoured autocratic government over republican alternatives. In reality, his comparative analysis of principalities and republics demonstrates that each system offers distinct advantages and faces unique vulnerabilities depending on historical circumstances and social conditions. The tension between these two works reflects deeper questions about human nature, political development, and the relationship between individual excellence and collective flourishing that continue to shape contemporary political debates. The Prince addresses the specific challenges facing leaders who must create order in chaotic conditions, maintain power in unstable environments, and implement reforms despite organized resistance. These situations require concentrated authority, rapid decision-making, and the ability to use force effectively when persuasion fails. Successful princes must develop personal qualities that enable them to dominate complex political environments through superior strategic thinking and psychological manipulation. They cannot rely on established institutions, legal procedures, or popular consent, because those resources either do not exist or have become corrupted and ineffective. Instead, they must create new institutional arrangements through the force of their individual will and maintain those arrangements through a combination of fear, respect, and carefully managed benefits for key constituencies. This makes princely leadership inherently personal, charismatic, and dependent on exceptional individual capabilities that cannot be easily transferred to successors. The Discourses examines how Republican institutions can harness collective intelligence, distribute power safely among multiple groups, and maintain political vitality over extended time periods. Successful republics develop impersonal procedures that function effectively regardless of individual leadership quality and create systematic incentives for citizens to contribute their talents toward common purposes. They also establish checks and balances that prevent any single person or faction from accumulating enough power to destroy the system from within. This makes Republican government potentially more stable and more capable of complex problem-solving than autocratic alternatives. But it also makes republics vulnerable to paralysis during emergencies, corruption during periods of prosperity, and factional conflict when social consensus breaks down. Republican success depends on maintaining sufficient civic virtue among the general population to support institutions that require active citizen participation and voluntary compliance with collective decisions. The key difference between princely and republican approaches involves their respective solutions to what political scientists now call the principal-agent problem. How do you ensure that leaders will pursue public purposes rather than private interests when they possess the power necessary for effective governance? Principalities solve this problem by making the ruler's personal success dependent on the general welfare of their subjects. Princes who destroy their economies, provoke unnecessary wars, or create internal chaos will eventually lose their power to more competent competitors. This creates alignment between individual ambition and collective benefit, without requiring moral virtue or altruistic motivation. But it also concentrates enormous risks in individual psychology and provides no systematic mechanism for correcting bad decisions or replacing incompetent leadership. Republics solve the principal-agent problem through institutional competition and distributed accountability. Multiple officials check each other's behavior, and regular elections allow citizens to replace unsatisfactory leaders without violent revolution. This reduces the risks associated with individual incompetence or corruption and creates systematic incentives for responsive governance. But it also makes decisive action more difficult and creates opportunities for special interests to capture governmental processes through superior organization and resources. Republican institutions work well when citizens possess sufficient education, economic security, and civic engagement to monitor their representatives effectively. They fail when social inequality becomes too extreme, when external pressures require rapid responses, or when internal divisions make compromise impossible. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that the choice between princely and republican government should depend on specific historical circumstances rather than abstract philosophical preferences. New nations emerging from colonial rule, societies recovering from civil wars, and communities facing existential external threats may require princely leadership to create basic stability and security. Established societies with educated populations, diversified economies, and stable international environments may benefit more from republican institutions that can process complex information and build broad consensus for difficult policies. The tragedy is that successful princes often resist transitioning to republican institutions, even when changing circumstances make such transitions desirable. Meanwhile, republican governments often prove incapable of producing the decisive leadership necessary during genuine emergencies. This creates a cyclical pattern where political systems alternate between autocratic and republican phases, depending on external pressures and internal development. The deeper philosophical tension between the prince and the discourses reflects competing views about human potential and social development. The prince assumes that most people will remain fundamentally self-interested, short-sighted, and politically passive, regardless of institutional arrangements. This makes exceptional individual leadership necessary for achieving any significant political accomplishments. The discourses suggest that appropriate institutions can cultivate civic virtue and encourage broader participation in political life. This makes collective wisdom and distributed leadership possible under favourable conditions. Modern democratic theory continues to struggle with this same tension between elite leadership and popular participation, between efficiency and representation, between expertise and accountability. Machiavelli's comparative analysis provides a framework for thinking about these trade-offs without assuming that any single institutional design will work optimally under all possible circumstances. The goal is not to choose between princely and republican approaches permanently, but to understand when each approach offers advantages and how societies might transition between different institutional arrangements as their circumstances change. Part 6. War as the ultimate political art. Machiavelli's military philosophy extends far beyond technical discussions of tactics and strategy to encompass a comprehensive theory about the relationship between armed force and political order. He argued that the art of war represents the most fundamental political skill because all other governmental activities ultimately depend on the ability to protect the state from internal and external enemies. This insight generates a systematic analysis of military organization, citizen soldiers versus mercenaries, and the role of violence in creating and maintaining political institutions that has influenced military thinking from Napoleon to modern counterinsurgency doctrine. But his most profound contribution involves demonstrating how military preparation shapes domestic political culture and how different approaches to organizing armed force create different types of political systems. The foundation of Machiavellian military analysis rests on his observation that states cannot survive without effective military institutions, but military institutions pose constant threats to political stability and civilian authority. This creates what we might call the military dilemma of political order. Weak military institutions leave the state vulnerable to foreign conquest and domestic revolution. Strong military institutions create the possibility of military coups and the subordination of civilian government to military priorities. Different solutions to this dilemma generate different types of political systems with different strengths and weaknesses. Understanding these trade-offs becomes essential for designing sustainable political institutions and for evaluating the performance of existing governments. Machiavelli identified three basic approaches to organizing military force, each with distinct political implications and practical consequences. First, rulers can rely on mercenary armies composed of professional soldiers fighting for monetary compensation rather than political loyalty. This approach minimizes the risk of military coups since mercenaries have no direct stake in domestic political arrangements and can be dismissed when their services are no longer needed. But it also creates enormous financial costs, questionable battlefield reliability, and strategic vulnerabilities when mercenary commanders develop their own political ambitions. Mercenaries fight only as hard as their contracts require and will abandon their employers when offered better terms by opposing forces. They also tend to prolong conflicts unnecessarily to maximize their profits and may switch sides during battles if the military situation appears hopeless. Second, rulers can rely on auxiliary troops provided by allied states or powerful domestic factions. This approach reduces financial costs and can provide access to specialized military capabilities that would be expensive to develop independently. But it also creates dangerous dependencies on external powers who may withdraw their support at crucial moments or use their military assistance to influence domestic political decisions. Auxiliaries ultimately serve their own governments rather than their temporary employers, which means they cannot be trusted completely during conflicts where their home states have independent interests. Domestic auxiliaries provided by powerful families or regional leaders create similar problems since they remain loyal to their original patrons rather than to central governmental authority. Both forms of auxiliary force undermine political independence and create vulnerabilities that sophisticated enemies will eventually exploit. Third, rulers can develop their own native military institutions based on citizen soldiers who fight to defend their homes, families, and political communities. This approach creates the strongest possible motivation for battlefield effectiveness, since soldiers are defending their own vital interests rather than fulfilling contractual obligations or serving foreign masters. Citizen armies also cost less than mercenary alternatives and provide rulers with military force that cannot be easily bribed or corrupted by enemy agents. But citizen soldiers pose greater threats to domestic political stability since they possess both military training and direct stakes in political outcomes. They may use their military capabilities to resist unpopular policies, support political opponents, or demand greater influence over governmental decisions. Managing citizen armies requires different political skills than managing mercenaries or auxiliaries and creates ongoing tensions between military efficiency and civilian control. The relationship between military organization and political culture represents perhaps the most important aspect of Machiavellian military philosophy. Societies that rely primarily on mercenary force tend to develop passive, commercially oriented political cultures where citizens focus on private economic activities and leave political decisions to professional elites. This can generate prosperity and stability during peaceful periods, but creates vulnerabilities during military crises when rapid mobilization becomes necessary. Societies that develop citizen military institutions tend to cultivate more active, participatory political cultures where citizens expect to influence major policy decisions and accept personal responsibilities for collective defense. This creates greater resilience during military emergencies, but also generates more domestic political conflict and makes efficient decision-making more difficult. The choice between these alternatives reflects deeper questions about the relationship between individual freedom and collective security that continue to shape contemporary debates about military policy and civic obligation. Machiavelli's analysis of fortifications, siege warfare, and defensive strategy illustrates how technological developments interact with political institutions to create new strategic possibilities and vulnerabilities. The development of gunpowder artillery during the late 15th century fundamentally altered the military balance between offensive and defensive capabilities. Traditional high walls and strong castles became liabilities rather than assets when they could be destroyed quickly by cannon fire. This technological shift required new approaches to fortification design, new tactics for siege warfare, and new strategies for territorial defence that favoured mobile armies over static defensive positions. But the political implications extended far beyond purely military considerations. Societies that adapted quickly to new military technologies gained strategic advantages over more conservative competitors. Rulers who understood how technological change affected military effectiveness could exploit temporary advantages to expand their power and influence. Meanwhile, political systems that resisted military innovation often found themselves conquered by more adaptable enemies regardless of their other strengths and achievements. This creates an ongoing dynamic where political survival requires constant attention to military developments and willingness to modify existing institutions when technological or strategic circumstances change. Modern examples include the impact of nuclear weapons on international relations, the role of cyber warfare in contemporary conflicts, and the implications of artificial intelligence for future military competition. Part 7. Religion as Statecraft, the Political Utility of Sacred Power. Machiavelli's treatment of religion represents one of the most sophisticated and controversial aspects of his political philosophy, revealing deep insights about the relationship between spiritual belief and political order that anticipate modern theories of civil religion, ideological hegemony, and cultural legitimacy. Unlike medieval political theorists who treated religion as a source of eternal moral truths that should guide political decision-making, Machiavelli analyzed religion primarily as a political instrument that could be used effectively or ineffectively depending on circumstances and leadership skills. This instrumental approach to sacred traditions scandalized religious authorities and continues to generate interpretive debates about whether Machiavelli was a secret atheist, a conventional believer, or something more complex and ambiguous. But his practical insights about how religious institutions interact with political power remain remarkably prescient and continue to influence contemporary analysis of political legitimacy and social cohesion. The foundation of Machiavellian religious analysis rests on his observation that all successful political systems require some form of shared belief system that motivates citizens to sacrifice individual interests for collective purposes. Purely rational political calculation cannot generate sufficient motivation for the kinds of personal sacrifices that effective governance sometimes requires. Citizens must believe that their political community serves purposes larger and more important than immediate material benefits if they are going to support unpopular but necessary policies, pay taxes that exceed their direct governmental benefits, or risk their lives in military service. Religion provides the most powerful source of such transcendent motivation because it connects political obligations to ultimate spiritual meanings that rational argument alone cannot establish. This makes religious institutions potentially valuable political assets, but it also makes them potentially dangerous political rivals, depending on how religious and political authorities manage their relationship. The key question becomes how to harness religious motivation for political purposes without allowing religious institutions to dominate or undermine governmental authority. Machiavelli's analysis of ancient Roman religion illustrates how sophisticated political systems can integrate spiritual and temporal authority to create mutually reinforcing sources of legitimacy and social discipline. Roman religious practices were designed primarily to serve civic purposes, rather than to provide individual spiritual salvation or moral instruction. Religious ceremonies reinforced social hierarchies, celebrated political achievements, and created collective experiences that strengthened group identity and solidarity. Religious institutions supported governmental authority by teaching citizens that their political obligations reflected divine will and that political success indicated divine favour. But Roman religion also provided resources for political criticism and reform when existing institutions became corrupt or ineffective. Religious traditions could be invoked to justify opposition to tyrannical rulers or to support necessary changes in governmental policies and procedures. This created a dynamic balance where religion supported political stability without preventing political adaptation and innovation. Religious and political institutions reinforced each other while maintaining sufficient independence to avoid complete subordination of either sphere to the other. The contrast between ancient Roman religion and contemporary Christianity reveals how different religious systems create different political possibilities and constraints. Christianity emphasizes individual spiritual salvation, universal moral principles, and transcendent values that often conflict with practical political necessities. Christian moral teaching encourages forgiveness rather than punishment, humility rather than pride, otherworldly focus rather than political engagement. These spiritual emphases can undermine the psychological qualities necessary for effective political leadership and military service. Christian institutions also claim independent authority to evaluate political decisions according to religious criteria, which creates potential conflicts between religious and political leadership. When these conflicts become severe, they can paralyze governmental decision-making or generate civil wars between competing sources of ultimate authority. But Christianity also provides powerful resources for political legitimacy and social cohesion when religious and political authorities coordinate their activities effectively. Christian moral teaching can motivate extraordinary personal sacrifices for collective purposes and create strong social bonds that transcend economic and ethnic divisions. Machiavelli's practical recommendations for managing religious institutions focus on maintaining beneficial aspects of religious influence while minimizing potential conflicts and vulnerabilities. Political leaders should publicly respect religious traditions and participate in religious ceremonies to demonstrate their commitment to transcendent values and shared cultural traditions. This builds trust with religious citizens and provides access to religious sources of motivation and legitimacy. But leaders should also maintain sufficient independence from religious institutions to make decisions based on political necessity rather than religious doctrine when these considerations conflict. This requires sophisticated diplomatic skills and careful attention to religious sensibilities, since open conflicts between religious and political authority can be extremely damaging to both institutions. The goal is to create cooperative relationships that allow both religious and political institutions to pursue their distinctive purposes while supporting rather than undermining each other. The deeper philosophical implications of Machiavellian religious analysis extend beyond tactical considerations to raise fundamental questions about the relationship between truth and utility in political life. If religious institutions serve primarily political functions, what happens to their claims about spiritual truth and moral authority? If political leaders manipulate religious symbols and traditions for strategic purposes, can those symbols retain their power to inspire genuine devotion and moral commitment? If citizens understand that their religious beliefs are being used for political purposes, will those beliefs continue to provide effective motivation for collective action? These questions anticipate modern debates about ideology, propaganda, and the role of shared myths in maintaining social cohesion. They also connect to contemporary discussions about civil religion, political ritual, and the ways that secular political systems attempt to generate the kinds of transcendent motivation that traditional religions provided more naturally. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that some form of shared belief system remains necessary for effective political order, but it does not resolve the deeper tensions between instrumental and intrinsic approaches to sacred traditions. This creates ongoing challenges for political leaders who must navigate between cynical manipulation and naive idealism in their relationships with religious institutions and spiritual beliefs. Part 8. The Eternal Recurrence of Constitutional Forms. Machiavelli's theory of constitutional cycles represents one of his most sophisticated contributions to political science, providing a dynamic framework for understanding how political systems evolve, degenerate, and transform over time. Drawing on classical sources, particularly Polybius, but adding his own empirical observations and psychological insights, he developed a systematic account of why no political system can maintain its original form indefinitely. This cyclical analysis helps explain the rise and fall of particular governments, the relationship between institutional design and political culture, and the possibilities for intentional constitutional reform. Modern political scientists continue to find his insights valuable for understanding democratic transitions, institutional decay, and the long-term dynamics of political development. The foundation of Machiavellian cycle theory rests on his analysis of how different constitutional forms generate internal contradictions that eventually lead to their transformation or collapse. Each type of government creates specific incentives and constraints that shape the behavior of political actors over time. These behavioral patterns gradually alter the social and psychological conditions that originally made that form of government effective. Eventually, the gap between institutional requirements and actual human behavior becomes so large that the system cannot function effectively and must either reform itself or be replaced by something completely different. This process operates according to predictable patterns that careful observation can identify and analyze, making it possible to anticipate political changes and potentially to design institutions that can resist or manage cyclical pressures more effectively. But the same psychological and social forces that drive constitutional change also make it extremely difficult for political actors to recognize and respond to cyclical pressures before they become overwhelming. The classical sequence begins with monarchy, the rule of a single person who possesses superior virtue and uses that excellence to create political order from chaos or confusion. Successful monarchs establish laws, institutions, and cultural traditions that provide stability and security for their subjects. But monarchical success creates conditions that undermine the very qualities that made monarchy effective in the first place. As society becomes more stable and prosperous, the immediate need for exceptional individual leadership decreases while opportunities for luxury and self-indulgence increase. Subsequent rulers inherit power rather than earning it through demonstrated competence, and they often lack the virtue that their predecessors possessed. Meanwhile, prolonged stability makes citizens less willing to accept arbitrary authority and more interested in participating in political decisions that affect their lives. The combination of declining leadership quality and rising popular expectations gradually transforms effective monarchy into oppressive tyranny. Citizens who initially welcomed royal authority eventually come to resent it, creating conditions for revolutionary change. The overthrow of tyranny typically brings aristocracy, the rule of the few who possess superior wealth, education, or social status. Aristocratic government can be highly effective when aristocrats possess genuine excellence and use their advantages to serve broader public purposes. Aristocratic leaders often have superior education, broader perspectives and longer time horizons than either monarchical rulers or democratic majorities. They can make complex decisions that require technical expertise and can resist popular pressures for short-sighted policies that would damage long-term public interests. But aristocratic success creates its own internal contradictions as established elites become complacent and self-serving over time. Second and third generation aristocrats often lack the virtue that earned their families political prominence and begin using their positions primarily to protect inherited privileges rather than to provide effective leadership. Meanwhile, prosperity creates new sources of wealth and talent that challenge existing aristocratic monopolies on political power. Excluded groups develop resentment against aristocratic privilege and begin demanding broader political participation. The transformation of virtuous aristocracy into corrupt oligarchy creates conditions for democratic revolution, led by popular leaders who promise to restore government to the people. Democratic government can be highly effective when citizens possess sufficient education, economic security, and civic virtue to participate constructively in political decision-making. Democracy harnesses collective intelligence more effectively than any alternative system and creates strong incentives for responsive leadership. Democratic institutions also provide peaceful mechanisms for resolving conflicts and for adapting policies to changing circumstances without violent revolution. But democratic success gradually undermines the social conditions necessary for effective democratic governance. Prosperity makes citizens more focused on private concerns and less willing to invest time and energy in civic activities. Political success attracts demagogues who exploit democratic procedures to gain power without possessing genuine commitment to democratic values. Meanwhile, economic inequality creates factional conflicts that democratic institutions cannot resolve peacefully. The degeneration of democracy into mob rule or factional chaos creates conditions where citizens become willing to accept renewed autocratic authority in exchange for stability and security. This completes the constitutional cycle and returns society to the starting point, though usually at a different level of development and with different specific characteristics. The cyclical pattern can be interrupted by external conquest, natural disasters, or other extraordinary events that alter the normal dynamics of political development. It can also be slowed or modified by institutional innovations that address some of the inherent weaknesses of particular constitutional forms. But the underlying psychological and social forces that drive constitutional change cannot be eliminated entirely through institutional design alone. This means that political systems must constantly adapt and reform themselves to remain effective, and that even the best institutional arrangements will eventually face pressures that require fundamental modifications. The practical implications of cyclical analysis extend far beyond historical speculation to provide guidance for contemporary constitutional design and political reform. Understanding cyclical pressures can help political leaders anticipate potential problems and develop institutional modifications that address emerging weaknesses before they become critical. It can also help citizens evaluate their political systems more realistically and avoid both naive optimism about permanent solutions and paralyzing pessimism about inevitable decline. Most importantly, it suggests that political health requires ongoing attention to constitutional maintenance and periodic renewal, rather than simply assuming that good institutions will remain effective indefinitely. Modern democratic societies face many of the same cyclical pressures that Machiavelli identified, including declining civic participation, rising inequality, and the emergence of demagogic leadership. His analysis provides a framework for understanding these challenges and for developing responses that address underlying causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Part 9. Conflict as the engine of Republican vitality. Perhaps Machiavelli's most counterintuitive and revolutionary insight involves his analysis of political conflict as a source of governmental strength rather than weakness. Traditional political theory treated domestic conflict as a sign of institutional failure and sought to design systems that would minimize disagreement and promote harmony. Machiavellian analysis reveals that certain types of conflict actually improve governmental performance by preventing the concentration of power, encouraging political innovation, and maintaining civic engagement among different social groups. This insight anticipates modern theories of democratic competition, checks and balances, and pluralistic representation that have become central to contemporary constitutional design. But his analysis goes beyond institutional mechanics to examine the psychological and social dynamics that make productive conflict possible, and to identify the conditions under which conflict becomes destructive rather than beneficial. Understanding these dynamics remains crucial for maintaining healthy democratic institutions and for managing the inevitable tensions that arise in complex political systems. The foundation of Machiavellian conflict analysis rests on his observation that all societies contain fundamental divisions between different groups with different interests, values, and priorities. These divisions cannot be eliminated through institutional design or moral education, because they reflect real differences in social position, economic circumstances, and cultural background. Attempts to suppress or ignore these differences typically result in the domination of one group over others rather than the creation of genuine harmony. Meanwhile, the excluded groups develop resentment and frustration that eventually explodes in violent revolution or systematic resistance. Effective political systems must acknowledge these fundamental divisions and create institutional mechanisms that allow different groups to pursue their interests through peaceful competition rather than violent confrontation. This requires sophisticated constitutional arrangements that protect minority rights while enabling majority decision-making, that provide multiple access points for political influence while maintaining governmental effectiveness. The specific example that Machiavelli analyzed most extensively involved the conflict between patricians and plebeians in the Roman Republic. Traditional historical accounts treated this conflict as a source of instability that weakened Roman institutions and contributed to the eventual collapse of republican government. Machiavellian analysis reveals that patrician-plebeian conflict actually strengthened Roman institutions by preventing either group from establishing complete political dominance. When patricians attempted to monopolize political power, plebeian resistance forced them to share authority and to make their rule more responsive to broader social needs. When plebeians pushed for changes that would undermine institutional stability, patrician resistance forced them to moderate their demands and to accept gradual rather than revolutionary transformation. The dynamic tension between these groups created a system of mutual checks that prevented either tyranny or mob rule while encouraging institutional innovation and adaptation. The psychological mechanisms that make productive conflict possible depend on several crucial conditions that distinguish beneficial competition from destructive factional warfare. First, competing groups must share sufficient common values and interests to maintain basic loyalty to the overall political system, even when they disagree about specific policies or procedures. Groups that view their opponents as existential threats or as fundamentally illegitimate will seek to destroy rather than compete with them. This makes compromise impossible and transforms political competition into civil war. Second, institutional procedures must provide realistic opportunities for all significant groups to influence political outcomes through peaceful means. Groups that feel permanently excluded from political influence will eventually resort to extra-legal methods to pursue their interests. Third, the stakes of political competition must remain limited so that electoral or policy defeats do not threaten the fundamental interests or identities of losing groups. When political outcomes determine group survival, competition becomes zero-sum and cooperation becomes impossible. The institutional mechanisms that channel conflict in productive directions require careful design to balance competing requirements for representation, effectiveness, and stability. Multiple access points for political influence allow different groups to pursue their interests through different institutional venues when they cannot achieve their goals through normal electoral processes. This might include independent courts, federalist arrangements, administrative agencies, or various forms of direct democracy that provide alternatives to majoritarian decision-making. But these multiple access points must be coordinated effectively to prevent governmental paralysis or the systematic obstruction of necessary policy changes. Similarly, protection for minority rights must be balanced against the need for decisive action during emergencies or when broad social consensus supports particular policy directions. Creating these balances requires ongoing constitutional maintenance and adjustment as social conditions and group relationships change over time. The transformation of productive conflict into destructive factionalism represents one of the greatest threats to Republican institutions and requires constant vigilance from political leaders and citizens. Machiavelli identified several warning signs that indicate when normal political competition is degenerating into irreconcilable factional warfare. Groups begin viewing political opponents as enemies, rather than as legitimate competitors with different interests and perspectives. Political rhetoric shifts from policy disagreements to personal attacks and character assassination. Institutional procedures become weapons for gaining tactical advantages rather than neutral mechanisms for resolving disagreements fairly. Violence or threats of violence begin to play roles in normal political processes. Groups begin seeking to change basic constitutional rules to ensure permanent advantages over their opponents. External powers begin exploiting domestic divisions to advance their own interests at the expense of national unity. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian conflict analysis becomes apparent when examining the challenges facing modern democratic systems around the world. Rising political polarization, declining trust in institutions, and increasing resort to extra-constitutional methods of political competition all reflect the kinds of factional degeneration that Machiavelli identified as threats to Republican government. His analysis suggests that addressing these problems requires more than simply encouraging civility or promoting bipartisan cooperation. Instead, it requires systematic attention to the underlying social and economic conditions that make productive conflict possible, including reasonable economic equality, shared civic education, and institutional arrangements that provide realistic opportunities for all significant groups to influence political outcomes. It also requires political leadership that understands how to manage conflict constructively rather than exploiting divisions for short-term partisan advantage. The goal is not to eliminate political conflict, which is both impossible and undesirable, but to maintain the social and institutional conditions that allow conflict to strengthen rather than destroy democratic institutions. Part 10. The Paradox of Innovation and the Problem of Founding. The final pillar of Machiavellian political philosophy addresses perhaps the most difficult challenge in political life, the problem of creating new institutions or fundamentally reforming existing ones when those changes threaten established interests and familiar patterns of behaviour. Machiavelli recognized that even beneficial political innovations face systematic resistance because change itself creates uncertainty and anxiety regardless of its ultimate merits. This creates a paradox where societies most in need of institutional reform are often least capable of implementing necessary changes, while societies with effective institutions may become too complacent to adapt when circumstances require modification. Understanding this paradox remains crucial for anyone attempting large-scale political change, whether in governmental institutions, business organizations, or social movements. The psychological and strategic insights that Machiavelli developed continue to influence theories of organizational change, revolutionary strategy, and institutional development across multiple disciplines. But his analysis also reveals the inherent limitations and tragic costs associated with fundamental political transformation, even when that transformation serves legitimate and important purposes. The foundation of the innovation paradox rests on Machiavelli's observation that human beings are naturally conservative creatures who prefer familiar arrangements to uncertain alternatives, even when those familiar arrangements cause significant problems. This conservatism operates at both psychological and practical levels that reinforce each other in ways that make change extremely difficult. Psychologically, people develop emotional attachments to existing institutions and procedures that provide predictability and identity, even when those institutions function poorly. Change threatens these attachments and creates anxiety about loss of status, security, or meaning, regardless of potential benefits. Practically, existing institutions create vested interests among people who benefit from current arrangements and who will resist changes that might reduce their advantages. These psychological and practical sources of resistance combine to create powerful coalitions opposed to reform, even when the need for change appears obvious to objective observers. Meanwhile, potential beneficiaries of proposed changes often provide weak support for reform because they remain uncertain about outcomes and doubtful about implementation. People can see the problems with existing arrangements clearly because they experience those problems directly. But they can only imagine the benefits of proposed alternatives, and imagination provides weaker motivation than direct experience. This asymmetry between concrete opposition and hypothetical support creates enormous obstacles for reformers who must overcome determined resistance with uncertain assistance. The situation becomes even more difficult when proposed changes require extended implementation periods during which costs become apparent immediately while benefits remain distant and uncertain. Reform coalitions often collapse during these implementation periods as supporters lose enthusiasm and opponents maintain their determined resistance. The strategic implications of innovation resistance require reformers to develop sophisticated approaches that address both psychological and practical sources of opposition. Successful innovators must either overcome resistance through superior force or find ways to make change appear less threatening and more beneficial to key constituencies. The first approach requires concentrating enough power to impose changes despite opposition, but this concentration of power creates risks of tyranny and abuse that may undermine the very goals that motivated reform in the first place. The second approach requires building coalitions and managing communication in ways that reduce opposition while maintaining momentum for change. But this typically involves compromises that may weaken the effectiveness of proposed reforms. Either approach requires exceptional leadership skills and favourable circumstances that are rarely available when they are most needed. This explains why successful, large-scale political change is relatively rare and why most reform efforts fail or produce unintended consequences that create new problems while failing to solve existing ones. Machiavelli's analysis of successful political founders reveals several patterns that provide guidance for contemporary reform efforts, while illustrating the inherent difficulties and moral ambiguities associated with fundamental change. First, successful founders typically emerge during crisis periods when existing institutions have clearly failed, and when people become willing to accept risks associated with change. Crisis creates opportunities for reform by weakening resistance and increasing openness to alternatives, but it also creates pressures for rapid action that may prevent careful planning and consultation. Second, successful founders usually possess exceptional personal qualities that enable them to maintain focus and determination despite enormous obstacles and setbacks. But these same qualities often include ruthlessness and single-mindedness that create problems for democratic governance once new institutions are established. Third, successful founding typically requires some combination of persuasion and force, but the balance between these elements determines whether new institutions will be legitimate and stable over time. The moral paradoxes associated with political innovation create ongoing dilemmas for anyone committed to both effective reform and ethical behavior. Fundamental change often requires violating existing laws and procedures that have become obstacles to necessary improvements. But systematic violation of legal constraints undermines the rule of law and creates precedents that may be exploited by less well-intentioned actors in the future. Similarly, effective reform often requires concentrating power in ways that bypass normal democratic procedures and accountability mechanisms. But such concentration creates opportunities for abuse and may establish autocratic patterns that persist long after the original reform goals have been achieved. These dilemmas cannot be resolved through abstract moral reasoning because they involve genuine conflicts between important values that cannot be reconciled perfectly. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that reformers must accept responsibility for these moral costs, while working to minimize them rather than pretending that fundamental change can be achieved without any negative consequences. This requires moral seriousness and practical wisdom rather than moral purity or ideological consistency, qualities that are difficult to maintain under the pressures associated with large-scale political transformation. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian founding analysis becomes apparent when examining current challenges facing democratic institutions, international organizations, and various social movements around the world. Climate change, technological disruption, and global economic integration all require institutional innovations that threaten existing interests and familiar patterns of behavior. Understanding the dynamics of resistance and the requirements for successful change can help contemporary reformers develop more realistic strategies and avoid common pitfalls that have undermined previous reform efforts. But Machiavelli's analysis also suggests that some problems may be too large or too complex for existing political institutions to address effectively, creating needs for more fundamental changes that current democratic procedures cannot accommodate. This creates ongoing tensions between democratic values and practical effectiveness that require constant attention and creative institutional solutions. The goal is not to abandon democratic principles, but to find ways of adapting and extending them to address challenges that their original designers could not have anticipated. Part 11. The Economics of Power, Wealth, Taxation and Political Control. Machiavelli understood that political power ultimately depends on economic resources, but his analysis of the relationship between wealth and governance goes far beyond simple observations about the importance of money in politics. His economic philosophy examines how different approaches to taxation, spending, and wealth distribution create different types of political systems with different capabilities and vulnerabilities. This analysis anticipates modern theories of political economy, public finance, and the relationship between economic inequality and democratic stability. But his insights remain distinctive because they focus on the practical requirements for maintaining political power rather than on abstract theories of economic justice or efficiency. Understanding these economic dimensions of political power remains crucial for anyone seeking to build or maintain effective governmental institutions in any historical period. Modern democracies continue to struggle with many of the same economic challenges that Machiavelli identified, including the tension between popular demands for services and resistance to taxation, the relationship between private wealth and political influence, and the economic requirements for national defence and institutional maintenance. The foundation of Machiavellian economic analysis rests on his observation that governments require reliable sources of revenue to function effectively, but every method of raising revenue creates political costs that can undermine governmental legitimacy and stability. Taxation transfers resources from private individuals to public purposes, but it also reduces private incentives for economic production and creates resentment among those who must pay. Borrowing allows governments to finance current operations with future revenues, but it creates dangerous dependencies on creditors who may impose conditions that limit political independence. Confiscation provides immediate resources, but destroys trust and encourages capital flight that reduces long-term economic productivity. Military conquest can generate enormous wealth through plunder and tribute, but it requires expensive military institutions and creates ongoing security obligations that may exceed the benefits of expansion. Each approach to public finance involves trade-offs between immediate resource needs and long-term political sustainability that require careful analysis and strategic planning. The relationship between taxation policy and political legitimacy reveals one of the most important insights in Machiavellian economic theory. Governments that rely primarily on direct taxation of their own citizens must maintain high levels of popular support because taxpayers can organize resistance to policies they dislike. This creates incentives for responsive governance and limits the ability of rulers to pursue policies that serve only elite interests. But it also makes decisive action more difficult during emergencies when rapid resource mobilization becomes necessary for national survival. Governments that rely primarily on external sources of revenue, such as tribute from conquered territories or loans from foreign creditors, can act more independently of domestic popular opinion. But they also become vulnerable to external pressures and may lose touch with domestic social conditions in ways that create long-term political problems. The optimal balance between internal and external revenue sources depends on specific circumstances, but understanding these trade-offs helps explain why different political systems develop different fiscal institutions and why those institutions affect governmental performance in predictable ways. Modern examples include the relationship between oil revenues and authoritarian governance, the impact of foreign aid on democratic development, and the role of international financial markets in shaping domestic economic policies. Machiavelli's analysis of wealth distribution and social inequality provides insights that remain relevant for contemporary debates about economic policy and political stability. Extreme inequality creates political instability because it generates resentment among the poor and fear among the rich that eventually explodes in violent conflict. But attempts to redistribute wealth through governmental action create their own political problems because they require substantial state capacity and may reduce economic incentives for productive activity. The key insight is that sustainable political systems require some mechanism for preventing inequality from becoming so extreme that it threatens social cohesion and political legitimacy. Traditional aristocratic societies accomplished this through paternalistic obligations that required wealthy elites to provide protection and assistance to their social inferiors. Modern democratic societies attempt to accomplish this through progressive taxation and social welfare programs that redistribute resources through governmental institutions. But both approaches face ongoing challenges from economic changes that create new sources of inequality and new forms of social division. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that no single institutional solution can permanently resolve the tension between economic efficiency and political stability, which means that successful societies must continuously adapt their economic institutions to address emerging challenges. The relationship between private economic power and political influence represents one of the most persistent challenges in democratic governance that Machiavelli identified centuries before the emergence of modern capitalism. Wealthy individuals and organizations possess resources that can be used to influence political decisions through campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and various forms of economic pressure. This creates systematic advantages for economic elites that may undermine democratic equality and responsiveness to broader public interests. But attempts to limit the political influence of wealth often prove ineffective because economic resources can be deployed through multiple channels that are difficult to monitor and regulate comprehensively. Moreover, successful economic activity often requires the same skills and capabilities that make for effective political leadership, which means that excluding wealthy people from politics may also exclude talented individuals who could contribute to better governance. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that the goal should not be to eliminate the political influence of wealth, which is probably impossible, but rather to ensure that economic elites have incentives to use their influence in ways that serve broader public purposes rather than narrow private interests. This requires institutional arrangements that align private incentives with public goods and that provide realistic opportunities for non-wealthy groups to organize effective political opposition when necessary. Modern examples include campaign finance regulations, lobbying disclosure requirements, and various forms of public funding for political activities that help level the playing field between wealthy and non-wealthy political actors. The economic requirements for national defense illustrate how external threats interact with domestic political arrangements to shape fiscal institutions and governmental capabilities. Military security requires substantial ongoing investments in personnel, equipment and infrastructure that compete with other governmental priorities and private consumption for limited resources. Societies that face serious external threats must develop fiscal institutions capable of rapid resource mobilization during emergencies, but maintaining these capabilities during peaceful periods creates ongoing political tensions. Citizens naturally prefer to spend money on immediate personal benefits rather than on military preparations for hypothetical future conflicts. But inadequate military preparation can result in conquest or destruction that eliminates all other political and economic achievements. This creates one of the most difficult trade-offs in political economy because the costs of military preparation are immediate and visible while the benefits remain hypothetical until actual conflicts occur. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that successful societies must find ways to maintain military capabilities without allowing military expenditures to consume resources needed for economic development and domestic welfare. This requires sophisticated strategic planning and public education that helps citizens understand the relationship between military security and long-term prosperity. But it also requires military institutions that remain subordinate to civilian authority and that do not consume resources beyond what is necessary for legitimate security purposes. Part 12. Diplomacy and the Art of International Relations. Machiavelli's analysis of international relations represents the birth of modern diplomatic theory and strategic thinking, providing insights that continue to influence foreign policy analysis, international law, and military strategy 5 centuries after they were first developed. His approach to diplomacy reflects the same commitment to empirical observation and practical effectiveness that characterizes his domestic political analysis, but it extends these insights to the even more complex realm of relations between independent political entities. The international system operates according to different rules than domestic politics, because there is no overarching authority capable of enforcing agreements or preventing conflicts between sovereign states. This creates what modern theorists call an anarchic system, where each state must ultimately rely on its own resources and capabilities to ensure survival and prosperity. Understanding how to operate effectively in this anarchic environment requires different skills and strategies than those needed for domestic governance, though many of the same psychological insights about human nature and power dynamics continue to apply. Machiavelli's diplomatic philosophy provides a framework for thinking about these challenges that remains remarkably relevant for contemporary international relations. The foundation of Machiavellian diplomatic theory rests on his observation that international relations operate primarily according to considerations of power and interest rather than moral principles or legal obligations. States may sign treaties and make public commitments to various international norms, but they will violate these commitments whenever doing so serves their vital interests and when they possess sufficient power to avoid serious consequences. This does not mean that international agreements are meaningless or that moral considerations play no role in foreign policy decisions, but it does mean that successful diplomacy must be based on realistic assessments of what different actors can and will do under various circumstances rather than on assumptions about what they should do according to abstract principles. Effective diplomats understand that other states will pursue their own interests as they understand them, and they design their strategies accordingly rather than expecting other states to make significant sacrifices for the sake of international harmony or justice. This realist approach to international relations allows for more accurate predictions about state behavior and for more effective strategies for achieving foreign policy objectives. The role of alliances in international politics illustrates the complex calculations that states must make when deciding how to position themselves relative to other powers. Alliances can provide security benefits by combining the resources and capabilities of multiple states against common threats, but they also create obligations and constraints that limit independent action. Strong allies may drag weaker partners into conflicts that serve the strong allies' interests but threaten the weaker partner's security. Meanwhile, weak allies may prove unreliable during crises and may actually increase security risks by creating the appearance of strength without providing genuine additional capabilities. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that alliance decisions should be based on careful calculations about the specific benefits and costs involved in particular relationships rather than on general principles about the value of international cooperation. States should seek allies when doing so increases their security and freedom of action, but they should remain independent when alliance obligations would limit their ability to respond effectively to changing circumstances. This requires ongoing reassessment of alliance relationships as power balances and threat environments evolve over time. Modern examples include NATO expansion, shifting alliances in the Middle East, and the emergence of new partnership arrangements in the Asia-Pacific region. The relationship between military capability and diplomatic effectiveness represents one of the most important insights in Machiavellian international relations theory. Diplomatic negotiations ultimately depend on the underlying balance of power between the parties involved, which means that military weakness severely limits diplomatic options regardless of the skill of negotiators or the justice of particular positions. States that cannot defend themselves effectively will find that other states ignore their diplomatic protests and violate their interests with impunity. Meanwhile, states that possess superior military capabilities can often achieve their objectives through diplomatic pressure without actually having to use force. This creates what modern strategists call the diplomatic utility of military power, where the threat of force becomes a crucial resource for peaceful conflict resolution. But the relationship between military capability and diplomatic effectiveness is not straightforward, because the credible threat of force requires not just possession of military assets, but also the political will to use them when necessary. States that possess military capabilities but are known to be reluctant to use them may find that their diplomatic influence is limited despite their apparent strength. Conversely, states that demonstrate willingness to use force effectively may achieve diplomatic successes that exceed what their actual military capabilities would suggest. The problem of credible commitment in international relations creates ongoing challenges for diplomatic agreements and cooperative arrangements between states. Unlike domestic politics, where governmental institutions can enforce agreements between different parties, international agreements depend entirely on the continued willingness of each party to honor their commitments. This creates incentives for states to violate agreements whenever doing so would serve their immediate interests, which makes other states reluctant to enter into agreements in the first place. The result is what game theorists call a cooperation problem, where all parties would benefit from mutual cooperation but cannot trust each other enough to make cooperative behavior sustainable. Machiavelli identified several mechanisms that can help address this problem and make international cooperation more likely to succeed. First, agreements should be designed so that all parties have continuing incentives to honor their commitments rather than requiring immediate sacrifices for uncertain future benefits. Second, agreements should include monitoring and enforcement mechanisms that make violations costly and difficult to conceal. Third, agreements should be embedded in broader relationships that create multiple opportunities for retaliation and reward so that the costs of violation extend beyond the specific issue area covered by the agreement. The role of reputation and credibility in international relations illustrates how psychological factors interact with material capabilities to shape diplomatic outcomes. States that develop reputations for honoring their commitments will find it easier to negotiate favorable agreements because other states will trust them to implement their promises. Meanwhile, states that frequently violate their commitments will find that other states demand immediate compensation or refuse to negotiate seriously because they expect eventual betrayal. This creates long-term incentives for reliable behaviour, even when short-term interests might favour violation of specific agreements. But reputation building requires accepting occasional short-term costs to maintain credibility, and it can be destroyed quickly by single acts of betrayal that undermine years of careful relationship building. Machiavelli's analysis suggests that states must balance the immediate benefits of treaty violation against the long-term costs of damaged reputation, and that this calculation should include not just bilateral relationships, but also the broader international reaction to perceived unreliability. Modern examples include the impact of trade agreement violations on future economic negotiations, the role of human rights performance in international legitimacy, and the effects of nuclear proliferation decisions on security relationships. Understanding these reputation dynamics helps explain why states sometimes honour agreements even when violation would serve their immediate material interests, and why diplomatic relationships often extend far beyond the specific issues that originally brought countries together. Part 13. The problem of succession and institutional continuity. One of the most devastating challenges facing any political system involves ensuring smooth transitions of power when leaders die, retire, or are removed from office. Machiavelli recognized that succession crises represent moments of maximum vulnerability when existing institutions may collapse, external enemies may intervene, and domestic factions may attempt to seize control. His analysis of succession problems extends beyond simple questions of leadership selection to examine how different institutional arrangements either facilitate or complicate peaceful power transitions. This analysis remains crucial for understanding contemporary challenges in democratic transitions, authoritarian succession, and institutional reform in developing countries. The insights that Machiavelli developed about succession planning, institutional design, and the relationship between personal authority and systemic stability continue to influence political science research and practical policy making in contexts ranging from corporate governance to international development assistance. But his analysis also reveals the inherent limitations and tragic dimensions of succession planning, since even the best institutional arrangements cannot completely eliminate the risks associated with major leadership changes. The foundation of succession analysis rests on Machiavelli's distinction between personal authority that depends on the specific qualities and relationships of individual leaders and institutional authority that operates according to impersonal rules and procedures. Political systems that rely heavily on personal authority face severe succession challenges because the qualities that make particular leaders effective cannot be easily transferred to their successors. Charismatic leaders who build their authority on personal relationships, exceptional capabilities, or unique historical circumstances create political systems that may not survive their departure. Meanwhile, institutional systems that operate according to established procedures and legal frameworks can potentially maintain continuity across multiple leadership changes. But institutional authority depends on widespread acceptance of the legitimacy of those procedures and frameworks, which may erode over time if institutions fail to adapt to changing circumstances or if they become captured by particular factions. The challenge for political founders involves creating institutions that can maintain effectiveness and legitimacy without depending entirely on the continued presence of their creators. The specific mechanisms for leadership selection reveal different approaches to managing succession challenges, each with distinct advantages and vulnerabilities. Hereditary succession ensures predictable leadership transitions and may preserve institutional continuity, but it provides no guarantee that successors will possess the capabilities necessary for effective governance. Hereditary systems work reasonably well when governance requires primarily ceremonial functions or when strong institutional constraints limit the damage that incompetent leaders can cause. But they become dangerous when political circumstances require exceptional leadership qualities or when leaders possess substantial discretionary authority. Elective succession allows societies to choose leaders based on demonstrated capabilities and current needs, but it creates opportunities for faction conflict and may produce winners who lack legitimacy among significant portions of the population. Electoral systems work well when citizens possess sufficient information and judgment to evaluate candidates effectively, and when losing factions accept the legitimacy of electoral outcomes. But they may break down when electoral competition becomes so intense that losing sides refuse to accept defeat, or when electoral procedures become so complex that outcomes appear arbitrary or manipulated. Mixed systems that combine hereditary and elective elements attempt to capture the benefits of both approaches while minimizing their respective weaknesses, but they often create confusion about the sources of legitimate authority. The role of institutional memory and bureaucratic continuity in maintaining governmental effectiveness across leadership transitions illustrates how administrative systems can provide stability that transcends individual political careers. Professional bureaucracies that operate according to established procedures and technical expertise can continue functioning effectively even when political leadership changes frequently or dramatically. This administrative continuity prevents succession crises from disrupting essential governmental services and provides new leaders with institutional resources for implementing their policy priorities. But bureaucratic institutions may also resist necessary changes and may develop interests that conflict with democratically elected leadership. The challenge involves creating administrative systems that provide stability and expertise without becoming unresponsive to legitimate political direction. This requires careful attention to bureaucratic recruitment, training and accountability mechanisms that maintain professional standards while ensuring democratic control. Modern examples include civil service systems, independent regulatory agencies, and various forms of technocratic governance that attempt to insulate certain governmental functions from political interference while maintaining overall democratic accountability. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why some countries experience smooth leadership transitions, while others face institutional collapse during succession crises. The international dimensions of succession problems create additional complications that domestic institutional design cannot address completely. External powers may attempt to influence succession processes to install leaders who will serve their interests rather than those of the domestic population. This external interference can destabilize succession procedures and may create legitimacy problems for new leaders who appear to depend on foreign support rather than domestic consent. Meanwhile, succession crises often create opportunities for international conflicts as neighbouring states attempt to exploit temporary weaknesses or as new leaders seek to demonstrate their strength through aggressive foreign policies. Effective succession planning must therefore consider not just domestic institutional arrangements, but also international relationships and security environments that affect leadership transitions. This may require building international support for legitimate succession procedures and developing security arrangements that deter external interference during vulnerable transition periods. It may also require careful management of foreign policy during leadership changes to avoid creating unnecessary conflicts or appearing weak to potential adversaries. Modern examples include the role of international election monitoring, the impact of economic sanctions on authoritarian transitions, and the security guarantees that external powers sometimes provide during democratic consolidation processes. The psychological dimensions of succession planning involve managing the natural human resistance to acknowledging mortality and relinquishing power that affects both individual leaders and institutional supporters. Successful leaders often develop strong personal attachments to their positions and may find it difficult to prepare seriously for their eventual departure. This psychological resistance can prevent adequate succession planning and may create crises when leaders become incapacitated or die unexpectedly. Meanwhile, supporters of existing leaders may resist succession planning because it acknowledges the temporary nature of their influence and may strengthen potential rivals. Overcoming these psychological obstacles requires institutional arrangements that make succession planning routine and expected rather than exceptional and threatening. This might include term limits that create predictable departure dates, rotation systems that ensure regular leadership changes, or formal training programs that prepare multiple individuals for leadership responsibilities. It also requires cultural norms that celebrate peaceful power transitions and that treat succession planning as a mark of institutional maturity rather than personal weakness. The goal is to create expectations and procedures that make leadership transitions feel natural and beneficial rather than traumatic and dangerous for everyone involved. Part 14. Conspiracy, betrayal, and the management of elite competition. Political leadership inevitably creates enemies and rivals who may resort to conspiracy and violence when they cannot achieve their objectives through normal political processes. Machiavelli's analysis of conspiracy represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated treatments of elite political competition in the history of political thought, examining both the motivations that drive conspiratorial behavior and the defensive strategies that leaders can employ to protect themselves from internal threats. His insights about conspiracy dynamics remain remarkably relevant for understanding contemporary challenges, ranging from military coups to corporate takeovers to terrorist networks. But his analysis goes beyond simple tactical considerations to examine the deeper relationship between political trust, institutional legitimacy, and the psychological foundations of political authority. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone in positions of leadership who must navigate complex environments where cooperation and competition, loyalty and ambition often exist simultaneously among the same individuals. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian conspiracy analysis extends far beyond formal political context to include organizational dynamics in business, military, academic, and social movement contexts where similar patterns of elite competition and potential betrayal operate. The foundation of conspiracy analysis rests on Machiavelli's observation that political systems always contain ambitious individuals who believe they could exercise power more effectively than current leaders and who may be willing to use extra-legal methods to achieve their goals. These potential conspirators are not necessarily evil or immoral people, but rather individuals whose personal ambitions conflict with existing power arrangements in ways that cannot be resolved through normal institutional channels. The existence of such ambitious individuals is not a sign of institutional failure, but rather an inevitable consequence of political life in complex societies. Effective leaders must therefore develop strategies for managing elite competition that channel ambition in productive directions while preventing it from exploding in destructive conspiracy and violence. This requires sophisticated understanding of the psychological motivations that drive conspiratorial behavior and the social conditions that make conspiracy more or less likely to occur. It also requires institutional mechanisms that provide realistic opportunities for ambitious individuals to advance their careers and influence policy without resorting to revolutionary methods. The psychology of potential conspirators reveals several consistent patterns that effective leaders can learn to recognize and address before they become dangerous. First, conspirators typically believe that they have been unfairly denied recognition or advancement that they deserve based on their capabilities and contributions. This sense of injustice creates resentment that may initially focus on specific policies or decisions, but often evolves into broader opposition to existing leadership. Second, conspirators usually convince themselves that their personal advancement would serve broader public purposes rather than merely private interests. This self-justification allows them to view conspiracy as a patriotic duty rather than as selfish ambition, which reduces psychological barriers to dangerous action. Third, conspirators often underestimate the practical difficulties involved in successful conspiracy and overestimate the popular support they would receive if their efforts succeeded. This combination of moral self-justification and tactical overconfidence creates a psychological profile that leaders can learn to identify and address through appropriate combination of accommodation and deterrence. The goal is not to eliminate ambitious individuals, who often possess valuable talents and energy, but rather to redirect their ambitions towards constructive rather than destructive activities. The social dynamics of conspiracy formation illustrate how individual ambitions interact with broader social conditions to create opportunities for organized opposition to existing authority. Successful conspiracies require coordination among multiple individuals who are willing to risk their lives and fortunes for uncertain benefits. This coordination becomes easier when existing institutions have lost legitimacy among significant portions of the elite population and when potential conspirators believe that their chances of success exceed their risks of failure. Economic crises, military defeats, and visible corruption among current leaders all create conditions that make conspiracy more likely by reducing the costs of opposition and increasing the potential benefits of successful rebellion. Meanwhile, societies with high levels of social trust, effective institutions for managing elite competition, and visible mechanisms for peaceful power transitions experience fewer serious conspiracies because ambitious individuals have realistic alternative pathways for advancement. Understanding these social conditions allows leaders to address the underlying causes of conspiratorial behavior rather than simply reacting to specific threats after they have already emerged. The defensive strategies that Machiavelli recommended for protecting against conspiracy involve a sophisticated combination of institutional design, intelligence gathering, and psychological management that remains relevant for contemporary security analysis. First, leaders should develop multiple independent sources of information about elite attitudes and activities so that they can identify potential threats before they become organized and dangerous. This intelligence function requires careful balance between necessary security measures and excessive surveillance that creates resentment and undermines trust among loyal supporters. Second, leaders should maintain sufficient military and security capabilities to deter conspiracy attempts and to respond effectively when deterrence fails. But these capabilities must remain under reliable command and control structures that prevent security institutions themselves from becoming sources of conspiratorial threat. Third, leaders should design political institutions that provide realistic opportunities for ambitious individuals to advance their careers and influence policy through peaceful means rather than forcing them to choose between permanent subordination and dangerous rebellion. This might include regular leadership rotation, merit-based advancement systems, and advisory mechanisms that allow potential rivals to contribute their talents to governmental decision-making. The goal is to create institutional environments where cooperation serves individual ambitions better than conspiracy does. The aftermath of conspiracy attempts, whether successful or unsuccessful, creates ongoing challenges for political stability and institutional legitimacy that require careful management to prevent cycles of revenge and counter-conspiracy. Leaders who survive conspiracy attempts often become more suspicious and authoritarian in their subsequent behavior, which may alienate previously loyal supporters and create conditions for future conspiracy attempts. Meanwhile, harsh punishment of failed conspirators may create martyrs and inspire additional opposition, while lenient treatment may be interpreted as weakness that encourages further challenges. The optimal response depends on specific circumstances, but it typically requires demonstration that conspiracy attempts will fail while providing realistic opportunities for reconciliation and reintegration of opposition elements that are willing to accept peaceful political competition. This balance between firmness and mercy requires exceptional political judgment and may involve difficult decisions about individual cases that set precedents for future situations. Modern examples include truth and reconciliation processes, amnesty programs for former rebels, and various forms of power-sharing arrangements that attempt to channel previous opposition into constructive political participation. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why some political systems develop stable patterns of peaceful competition, while others experience recurring cycles of conspiracy, repression, and counter-conspiracy that undermine institutional development and economic progress. The goal is not to eliminate political competition, which is both impossible and undesirable, but rather to ensure that competition operates according to rules that strengthen rather than destroy the overall political system. Part 15. The Role of Law in Political Order. Machiavelli's analysis of law reveals a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between legal institutions and political power that challenges both naive legalism and crude authoritarianism. Unlike traditional approaches that treat law as either a source of eternal moral truth or as simply the command of whoever holds power, Machiavellian legal theory examines how legal institutions interact with other political forces to create stability, legitimacy, and effective governance. His insights about the political functions of law, the relationship between legal and extra-legal authority, and the conditions under which legal institutions strengthen or weaken political order continue to influence constitutional theory, comparative legal studies, and debates about the rule of law in developing countries. But his analysis also reveals the inherent limitations of purely legal approaches to political problems and demonstrates why effective governance requires more than simply establishing good laws and expecting them to enforce themselves. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in legal reform, constitutional design, or institutional development in contexts where formal legal institutions must compete with alternative sources of authority and legitimacy. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian legal analysis extends to ongoing debates about international law, corporate governance, and various forms of regulatory policy, where similar tensions between legal formalism and practical effectiveness operate. The foundation of Machiavellian legal theory rests on his observation that legal institutions derive their effectiveness not from their moral authority or logical consistency, but from their relationship to underlying patterns of political power and social acceptance. Laws that conflict with basic power relationships will be ignored or violated regardless of their formal status, while laws that reinforce existing power patterns may be followed even when they lack moral legitimacy. This means that effective legal reform requires attention to political and social conditions that make legal compliance possible and beneficial rather than simply drafting better legal texts and expecting them to change behaviour automatically. Legal institutions work best when they codify and systematize behavioral patterns that people are already motivated to follow for independent reasons, rather than when they attempt to impose completely new behavioral requirements against existing incentives and preferences. This insight helps explain why legal transplantation often fails when legal institutions developed in one society are imported into different social and political contexts without adequate attention to local conditions. It also explains why formal legal equality may not translate into substantive equality when underlying social and economic conditions create systematic advantages for particular groups. The relationship between legal and extra-legal sources of political authority illustrates one of the most important insights in Machiavellian political analysis. Even the most developed legal systems cannot address every possible situation that political leaders might face, which means that effective governance always requires some capacity for extra-legal action during emergencies or unprecedented circumstances. Leaders who confine themselves strictly to legal procedures may find themselves unable to respond effectively to genuine crises that threaten the survival of the political system itself. But leaders who too frequently resort to extra-legal authority may undermine the legitimacy and effectiveness of legal institutions that provide predictability and constraint during normal periods. The challenge involves developing judgment about when circumstances genuinely require extra legal action and ensuring that such action strengthens rather than weakens legal institutions over the long term. This requires sophisticated understanding of the relationship between emergency powers and constitutional government that continues to challenge democratic societies during national security crises, economic emergencies, and public health disasters. Modern examples include wartime executive powers, central bank independence during financial crises, and various forms of administrative discretion that allow governmental agencies to adapt formal rules to specific circumstances. The goal is not to eliminate all extra legal authority, which would make effective governance impossible, but rather to ensure that extra legal actions serve legitimate public purposes and that they operate within broader frameworks of accountability and constraint. The political functions of legal institutions extend far beyond their formal role in resolving disputes and punishing violations to include broader contributions to social coordination, legitimacy building, and power management. Legal procedures provide predictable mechanisms for resolving conflicts that might otherwise explode in violence or political instability. They also create common frameworks for understanding rights, obligations, and behavioral expectations that facilitate complex social and economic interactions among strangers. Perhaps most importantly, legal institutions provide alternative pathways for political influence that can channel opposition and ambition in constructive directions rather than forcing dissatisfied groups to choose between submission and rebellion. These political functions of law may be more important than their technical legal functions for maintaining overall political stability and effectiveness. Legal institutions that serve these broader political purposes effectively may retain legitimacy and influence even when their formal legal outputs are imperfect or inconsistent. Conversely, legal institutions that function well technically but fail to serve broader political functions may find themselves marginalized or ignored during periods of political stress. Understanding these multiple functions helps explain why legal reform efforts often produce unexpected results and why successful institutional development requires attention to political and social dynamics rather than simply technical legal considerations. The relationship between legal formalism and practical effectiveness creates ongoing tensions in constitutional design and legal reform that Machiavellian analysis helps illuminate. Formal legal clarity provides predictability and constraint that benefits both governmental officials and private citizens by creating stable expectations about behavioral consequences. But excessive formalism may prevent necessary adaptation to changing circumstances and may create opportunities for technical manipulation that serves narrow interests rather than broader public purposes. Meanwhile, flexible legal standards that allow adaptation to specific circumstances may provide better practical outcomes, but may also create uncertainty and opportunities for arbitrary action that undermine legal legitimacy. The optimal balance between formalism and flexibility depends on specific contexts and institutional capabilities, but it always involves trade-offs between different values and objectives that cannot be reconciled perfectly. Modern examples include debates about constitutional interpretation, administrative law standards, and international legal frameworks that must accommodate diverse national legal systems and political cultures. Machiavellian analysis suggests that these tensions cannot be resolved through purely legal reasoning, but require ongoing political judgment about how legal institutions can best serve broader purposes of effective governance and social cooperation. The goal is not to achieve perfect legal systems, which is impossible, but rather to design legal institutions that work well enough to support other political and social institutions while adapting to changing circumstances over time. The enforcement dimension of legal effectiveness reveals how legal institutions depend on broader political and social systems for their practical impact on behavior. Laws without enforcement are merely suggestions that may be ignored when compliance conflicts with individual interests or social pressures. But enforcement requires institutional capabilities and political will that may not exist independently of the legal system itself, creating potential circular dependencies where legal effectiveness depends on political conditions that legal institutions are supposed to create. This enforcement challenge becomes particularly acute in contexts where state capacity is limited, where social norms conflict with legal requirements, or where legal institutions lack legitimacy among significant portions of the population. Effective legal systems must therefore develop enforcement strategies that work within existing political and social constraints, while gradually building the institutional capabilities necessary for more comprehensive legal compliance over time. This might involve selective enforcement that focuses on the most important legal requirements, graduated sanctions that provide incentives for voluntary compliance, or various forms of community-based enforcement that harness social pressures to support legal objectives. Modern examples include community policing programs, regulatory approaches that emphasize cooperation rather than punishment, and international legal regimes that rely primarily on reputation and reciprocity rather than centralized enforcement mechanisms. Understanding these enforcement dynamics helps explain why formal legal reform often produces disappointing results and why successful institutional development requires sustained attention to implementation processes rather than simply legislative or constitutional drafting. Part 16. Popular Opinion and the Manipulation of Public Sentiment. The relationship between political leadership and public opinion represents one of the most complex and morally ambiguous aspects of Machiavellian political analysis, revealing deep insights about democratic legitimacy, mass psychology, and the conditions under which popular government can function effectively. Unlike traditional approaches that either idealize popular wisdom or dismiss mass opinion as inherently irrational, Machiavellian analysis examines the specific circumstances under which public sentiment supports or undermines effective governance. His insights about crowd psychology, political communication, and the manipulation of public opinion anticipate modern theories of media influence, electoral behavior, and propaganda that remain central to contemporary political science and democratic theory. But his analysis also raises disturbing questions about the compatibility between honest government and popular support that continue to challenge democratic societies around the world. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in democratic politics, whether as leaders, activists, or citizens who must navigate the tension between responsive governance and effective governance in complex modern societies. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian opinion analysis extends to ongoing debates about social media, political polarization, and various forms of information warfare that exploit the same psychological mechanisms that he identified centuries ago. The foundation of Machiavellian opinion analysis rests on his observation that popular political judgment operates according to different psychological mechanisms than expert analysis or individual decision-making. Large groups of people respond primarily to immediate, visible and emotionally compelling information rather than to complex arguments about long-term consequences or technical policy details. This means that effective political communication must appeal to popular psychological tendencies, rather than assuming that citizens will engage in the kind of careful deliberation that democratic theory often assumes. Popular opinion tends to be volatile, responding quickly to dramatic events, but losing interest when problems become routine or when solutions require sustained effort without immediate visible results. It also tends to be retrospective, evaluating leaders based on outcomes rather than intentions, and attributing complex social phenomena to simple, causal explanations that may or may not reflect actual reality. These psychological tendencies are not flaws that can be corrected through better civic education, but rather fundamental features of how large groups process political information that effective leaders must understand and accommodate. The moral paradox of popular leadership involves the tension between telling citizens what they want to hear and telling them what they need to know for effective self-governance. Democratic theory assumes that informed citizens can make good collective decisions about complex policy issues, but Machiavellian analysis suggests that full honesty about political realities may undermine the popular support necessary for effective leadership. Citizens may prefer comforting illusions about easy solutions to difficult problems rather than honest acknowledgements of trade-offs and limitations that realistic policy-making requires. Meanwhile, leaders who provide realistic assessments of policy challenges may find themselves defeated by demagogues who promise simple solutions to complex problems, regardless of whether those solutions can actually work. This creates incentives for strategic communication that emphasizes benefits while downplaying costs, that attributes failures to external enemies rather than inherent difficulties, and that promises more than can realistically be delivered. The result may be electoral success for leaders who understand popular psychology, but also systematic deception that undermines the informed consent that democratic legitimacy supposedly requires. The relationship between popular opinion and expert knowledge illustrates another fundamental challenge in democratic governance that Machiavellian analysis helps illuminate. Effective policy-making often requires technical expertise about complex subjects that most citizens cannot reasonably be expected to master. But democratic legitimacy requires that major policy decisions ultimately reflect popular preferences rather than expert judgment. This creates potential conflicts between what experts know to be necessary or effective and what citizens are willing to support through democratic processes. Citizens may demand policies that experts know will fail, or they may resist policies that experts know are necessary for addressing serious problems. Democratic leaders must therefore develop strategies for building popular support for expert-recommended policies without appearing to ignore or manipulate democratic opinion. This might involve educational campaigns that help citizens understand technical issues, consultation processes that give citizens meaningful influence over expert decisions, or institutional arrangements that insulate certain policy areas from direct democratic control while maintaining overall democratic accountability. Modern examples include central bank independence, scientific advisory committees, and various forms of deliberative democracy that attempt to combine expert knowledge with popular participation. The goal is not to eliminate either popular influence or expert input, but rather to find institutional arrangements that allow both to contribute effectively to policy-making processes. The strategic dimensions of opinion management reveal how skilled political leaders can shape popular sentiment to support necessary policies while maintaining democratic legitimacy and avoiding outright deception. Effective political communication involves framing complex issues in ways that make necessary policies appear consistent with popular values and interests, rather than requiring citizens to accept policies that conflict with their basic preferences. This might involve emphasizing certain aspects of policy proposals while de-emphasizing others, connecting policy arguments to widely shared values and experiences, or timing policy announcements to take advantage of favorable political circumstances. It might also involve building coalitions that demonstrate popular support for particular policies, creating visible policy successes that build credibility for more ambitious proposals, or gradually introducing controversial ideas through incremental steps that allow public opinion to adjust over time. These strategic approaches require sophisticated understanding of popular psychology and considerable political skill, but they allow democratic leaders to govern effectively without systematically deceiving their constituents. The key insight is that honest governance does not require complete transparency about every aspect of policy-making, but rather requires ensuring that popular consent is based on adequate understanding of fundamental choices and trade-offs, rather than on false premises or impossible promises. The institutional mechanisms for managing the relationship between leadership and opinion include various forms of representation, consultation, and accountability that attempt to balance responsiveness with effectiveness in democratic governance. Direct democracy through referendums and initiatives allows citizens to make policy decisions directly, but may produce outcomes that reflect temporary emotions rather than sustained deliberation about complex issues. Representative democracy through elected officials provides some insulation from popular volatility while maintaining democratic accountability, but it may create gaps between popular preferences and actual policy outcomes that undermine legitimacy. Various forms of deliberative democracy attempt to combine popular participation with structured discussion that improves the quality of democratic decision-making, but they may be too complex and time-consuming for routine policy-making. The optimal institutional arrangements depend on specific circumstances and policy areas, but they typically involve multiple mechanisms that provide different pathways for popular influence, while ensuring that democratic processes produce workable policy outcomes. Modern examples include citizen advisory committees, public comment processes for regulatory decisions, and various forms of participatory budgeting that give citizens direct influence over specific governmental decisions. Understanding these institutional options helps explain why some democratic societies manage the relationship between leadership and opinion more successfully than others, and why democratic governance requires ongoing institutional innovation rather than simply implementing fixed democratic procedures. The goal is not to achieve perfect alignment between popular opinion and policy outcomes, which is probably impossible in complex societies, but rather to ensure that democratic processes provide sufficient popular influence to maintain legitimacy while producing policy outcomes that actually address serious social problems effectively. Part 17. The Geography of Power, Territory, Borders and Strategic Space. The spatial dimensions of political power represent a crucial but often overlooked aspect of Machiavellian analysis that connects domestic governance to international relations, military strategy and economic development in ways that remain highly relevant for contemporary political analysis. Unlike approaches that treat territory simply as a backdrop for political action, Machiavellian geographical analysis examines how spatial factors shape political possibilities, create strategic advantages and vulnerabilities, and influence the effectiveness of different governmental approaches. His insights about territorial control, border management, and the relationship between geography and political institutions anticipate modern theories of geopolitics, regional development, and spatial economics that continue to influence military planning, international relations, and domestic policy analysis. But his analysis also reveals how geographical factors interact with human institutions and technological capabilities to create constantly evolving strategic environments that require adaptive responses from political leaders. Understanding these geographical dimensions becomes crucial for anyone involved in national security planning, regional development or international relations, where spatial factors create both opportunities and constraints that affect political outcomes. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian geographical analysis extends to ongoing debates about globalization, climate change and technological disruption that are altering traditional relationships between territory and political power in ways that require new forms of strategic thinking. The foundation of Machiavellian geographical analysis rests on his observation that territorial control represents the most fundamental requirement for political authority, but that effective territorial control requires more than simply occupying physical space. Political territories must be defended against external threats, administered through governmental institutions, and integrated economically and culturally to create genuine political communities rather than merely occupied zones. These requirements create different challenges depending on geographical characteristics, such as size, shape, topography, climate, natural resources, and location relative to other political entities. Small territories may be easier to defend and administer, but may lack the resources necessary for political independence, while large territories may possess greater resources but may be more difficult to integrate and defend effectively. Geographical features, such as mountains, rivers and coastlines, create natural boundaries that may facilitate defense and administration, but they may also create internal divisions that complicate political integration. Meanwhile, geographical location relative to trade routes, natural resources, and other political entities creates strategic opportunities and vulnerabilities that affect foreign policy options and domestic development possibilities. The relationship between territorial expansion and political stability illustrates one of the most important insights in Machiavellian strategic analysis. Territorial expansion can provide access to additional resources, eliminate external threats, and demonstrate governmental strength in ways that build domestic legitimacy and international prestige. But expansion also creates new administrative burdens, defense obligations, and potential sources of conflict that may exceed the benefits of additional territory. The optimal territorial size for any political entity depends on its institutional capabilities, available technology, and strategic environment, rather than on abstract principles about expansion or isolation. Historical examples demonstrate that both excessive expansion and excessive isolation can create fatal vulnerabilities, while the most successful political entities tend to expand gradually in ways that allow their institutions to adapt to new territorial responsibilities. Modern examples include the challenges facing federal systems that must balance local autonomy with national integration, the difficulties associated with nation-building in occupied territories, and the trade-offs between economic integration and political sovereignty in international organizations. The strategic dimensions of border management reveal how geographical boundaries interact with political institutions to create security challenges and opportunities that require ongoing attention from political leaders. Effective borders must be defensible against military threats, controllable for administrative purposes, and permeable enough to allow beneficial economic and cultural exchanges while preventing harmful infiltration. These multiple requirements often conflict with each other and require sophisticated institutional arrangements that can adapt to changing circumstances and threat environments. Natural geographical features may provide some defensive advantages, but they rarely correspond exactly to optimal political boundaries for administrative or economic purposes. Meanwhile, technological changes constantly alter the strategic value of particular geographical features and create new possibilities for both defense and attack that require corresponding adjustments in border management strategies. Modern examples include the impact of aviation on traditional geographical barriers, the role of cyber warfare in transcending physical boundaries, and the challenges created by climate change for existing border arrangements. The economic geography of political power illustrates how spatial factors interact with trade patterns, resource distribution and technological capabilities to create constraints and opportunities for domestic and international policy. Political entities that control strategically important geographical features such as harbours, mountain passes or river systems may be able to extract economic benefits from their geographical advantages, while those in less favourable locations may face systematic disadvantages. But geographical advantages can be enhanced or offset by institutional capabilities, technological innovations, and strategic alliances that allow political entities to transcend their immediate geographical limitations. The development of transportation and communication technologies constantly alters the strategic value of different geographical features and creates new possibilities for economic and political integration across traditional geographical barriers. Modern examples include the impact of containerization on port cities, the role of digital technologies in enabling remote economic activities, and the strategic importance of rare earth mineral deposits for technological development. Understanding these dynamic relationships helps explain why some geographical regions experience sustained economic and political success, while others remain marginalized despite apparent natural advantages. The cultural and psychological dimensions of territorial identity reveal how geographical spaces become invested with political meaning that affects citizen loyalty, national identity, and international legitimacy in ways that extend far beyond purely strategic considerations. Territories that are perceived as historical homelands, sacred spaces, or essential parts of national identity generate stronger emotional attachments and political support than territories that are viewed as merely strategic assets or economic resources. These emotional attachments can provide powerful resources for political mobilization and military resistance, but they can also create obstacles to rational strategic planning and peaceful conflict resolution. Meanwhile, territories with diverse populations, contested historical claims, or weak cultural integration may require different governmental approaches than territories with homogeneous populations and strong shared identities. The challenge for political leaders involves building sufficient territorial loyalty to maintain political cohesion while avoiding the kind of geographical nationalism that creates unnecessary conflicts with neighbouring political entities. Modern examples include the role of territorial disputes in international conflicts, the challenges facing multicultural societies with competing territorial claims, and the impact of migration and globalization on traditional territorial identities. Understanding these cultural dimensions helps explain why territorial conflicts often prove more difficult to resolve than purely strategic or economic disputes, and why effective territorial governance requires attention to symbolic and psychological factors as well as administrative and military considerations. The goal is not to eliminate territorial attachments, which provide important sources of political identity and social cohesion, but rather to manage them in ways that strengthen political communities while avoiding destructive conflicts over geographical boundaries. Part 18. Corruption and the Decay of Political Virtue. The analysis of political corruption represents one of Machiavelli's most sophisticated contributions to understanding how political systems degenerate over time and lose the capacity for effective governance. Unlike approaches that treat corruption simply as individual moral failure or criminal behavior, Machiavellian corruption analysis examines the systemic conditions that make corrupt behavior rational and profitable for political actors. His insights about the relationship between institutional design, social conditions, and corrupt incentives continue to influence contemporary research on governance quality, economic development, and democratic consolidation around the world. But his analysis also reveals why corruption problems cannot be solved simply through better laws or moral education, since corruption often represents a symptom of deeper institutional failures that require more fundamental reforms. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in institutional reform, economic development, or anti-corruption efforts in contexts where existing institutions have become captured by particular interests or where social conditions make honest governance difficult to sustain. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian corruption analysis extends to ongoing challenges in both developed and developing countries, where various forms of political corruption continue to undermine governmental effectiveness and democratic legitimacy. The foundation of Machiavellian corruption analysis rests on his distinction between individual corruption that involves specific acts of dishonesty or abuse of power and systemic corruption that involves the breakdown of institutional norms and procedures that normally constrain self-interested behavior. Individual corruption can occur in any political system and may be addressed through better monitoring, enforcement, and punishment of specific violations. But systemic corruption involves the erosion of shared expectations about appropriate behavior that makes corrupt practices normal and expected rather than exceptional and punishable. When corruption becomes systemic, honest behavior becomes disadvantageous because those who follow official rules and procedures find themselves unable to compete effectively with those who ignore institutional constraints. This creates what economists call a corruption equilibrium, where everyone has incentives to engage in corrupt behavior regardless of their personal moral preferences. Breaking out of corruption equilibria requires coordinated changes in institutional arrangements, enforcement mechanisms, and social expectations that go far beyond prosecuting individual corrupt actors. The relationship between economic inequality and political corruption illustrates how social conditions interact with institutional design to create environments that either support or undermine honest governance. Extreme economic inequality creates incentives for wealthy individuals and organizations to purchase political influence through various forms of corruption, while it also creates incentives for poorly paid public officials to supplement their incomes through corrupt practices. Meanwhile, economic inequality may reduce the political influence of middle-class groups, who typically provide the strongest constituency for honest government and institutional reform. When economic elites can achieve their policy objectives through corruption rather than through democratic processes, they have little incentive to support institutional reforms that would make government more responsive to broader public interests. Similarly, when public officials cannot support their families on official salaries, they may view corrupt practices as necessary survival strategies rather than as moral failures. Addressing systemic corruption, therefore, requires attention to underlying economic conditions, as well as to formal institutional arrangements and enforcement mechanisms. Modern examples include the relationship between natural resource wealth and governance quality, the impact of globalization on regulatory capture, and the role of economic development in supporting democratic consolidation. Understanding these relationships helps explain why anti-corruption efforts often fail when they focus exclusively on law enforcement rather than addressing broader social and economic conditions that make corruption rational and profitable. The institutional mechanisms that either facilitate or constrain corrupt behavior reveal how different governmental arrangements create different incentives for honest versus dishonest conduct among public officials. Institutions that concentrate power in few hands without effective oversight create opportunities for corruption, while institutions that distribute power among multiple actors with conflicting interests create natural checks against corrupt behavior. But excessive fragmentation of authority may also create corruption opportunities by making it difficult to assign responsibility for specific decisions and by creating multiple veto points that corrupt actors can exploit. The optimal institutional arrangements depend on broader social conditions, technological capabilities, and cultural norms that affect how different institutional designs function in practice. Transparency mechanisms that provide public access to governmental information can help constrain corruption by making corrupt behavior more visible and politically costly. But transparency alone may not be sufficient when civil society lacks the capacity to monitor government effectively, or when media institutions are themselves corrupted. Similarly, competitive elections can provide incentives for honest government by allowing voters to punish corrupt officials, but electoral competition may also create incentives for campaign finance violations and other forms of political corruption when campaign costs exceed the resources that candidates can raise through legitimate means. The international dimensions of corruption create additional challenges for anti-corruption efforts that domestic institutional reforms alone cannot address effectively. Globalization has created opportunities for corrupt actors to hide assets in foreign jurisdictions, to use international financial systems to launder corrupt proceeds, and to exploit differences between national legal systems to avoid prosecution. Meanwhile, international economic competition may create pressures for regulatory races to the bottom, where countries weaken anti-corruption standards to attract foreign investment or to support domestic businesses in international markets. Multinational corporations may engage in corrupt practices in countries with weak governance while maintaining clean reputations in their home countries, creating double standards that undermine global anti-corruption efforts. Addressing these international dimensions requires coordination among multiple countries and international organizations that may have conflicting interests and different approaches to corruption control. Modern examples include international efforts to combat money laundering, tax avoidance, and bribery in international business transactions that require complex multilateral cooperation and enforcement mechanisms. The cultural and psychological dimensions of corruption reveal how social norms and individual attitudes interact with institutional arrangements to create environments that either support or undermine honest governance. Societies with strong traditions of civic engagement, social trust, and respect for law tend to experience less corruption than societies where such norms are weak or absent. But cultural norms can change over time in response to institutional experiences and social conditions, which means that corruption problems can become self-reinforcing as corrupt practices undermine social trust and civic engagement. Similarly, individual attitudes toward corruption may depend on perceptions of fairness, effectiveness, and legitimacy in governmental institutions rather than simply on abstract moral principles. People who believe that governmental institutions serve only elite interests may view corruption as acceptable or even justified, while people who believe that institutions serve broader public purposes may be more willing to support anti-corruption efforts. This suggests that anti-corruption strategies must address issues of political legitimacy and institutional performance, as well as specific corrupt practices, if they hope to achieve sustainable improvements in governance quality. The goal is not simply to eliminate corrupt behavior, which may be impossible in complex societies, but rather to create institutional environments where honest behavior serves individual interests, while corrupt behavior carries sufficient costs to discourage systematic abuse of public office. This requires ongoing attention to institutional maintenance and renewal, rather than simply establishing anti-corruption laws and assuming they will enforce themselves automatically. Part 19. The relationship between knowledge and power. The intersection of intellectual authority and political authority represents one of the most complex and enduring challenges in political life that Machiavelli analyzed with characteristic realism and psychological insight. Unlike traditional approaches that either subordinate politics to philosophical truth or dismiss intellectual considerations as irrelevant to practical governance, Machiavellian analysis examines how different types of knowledge interact with political power to create both opportunities and dangers for effective leadership. His insights about the political utility of expertise, the limitations of theoretical knowledge, and the relationship between intellectual independence and political effectiveness continue to influence debates about technocratic governance, scientific advice in policymaking, and the role of universities in democratic societies. But his analysis also reveals why purely intellectual approaches to political problems often fail, and why successful political leadership requires different capabilities than those that generate intellectual achievement. Understanding these dynamics becomes crucial for anyone involved in policy making, academic research, or various forms of expertise that aim to influence political decisions in complex modern societies. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian knowledge analysis extends to ongoing debates about evidence-based policy, artificial intelligence in governance, and various forms of information warfare that exploit the same tensions between intellectual authority and popular legitimacy that he identified centuries ago. The foundation of Machiavellian knowledge analysis rests on his distinction between speculative knowledge that seeks truth for its own sake and practical knowledge that seeks effective action in specific circumstances. Speculative knowledge involves theoretical understanding of universal principles that remain constant across different contexts and time periods, while practical knowledge involves contextual judgment about what will work in particular situations given existing constraints and opportunities. Both types of knowledge provide valuable resources for political decision-making, but they operate according to different criteria and may generate conflicting recommendations about appropriate action. Speculative knowledge emphasizes logical consistency, empirical accuracy, and theoretical elegance that may not translate directly into effective policy recommendations. Practical knowledge emphasizes workability, political feasibility, and adaptive capacity that may require compromising theoretical purity for the sake of concrete results. Effective political leadership requires the ability to draw on both types of knowledge while understanding their respective limitations and appropriate spheres of application. The political utility of expertise illustrates how specialized knowledge can enhance governmental effectiveness while also creating new sources of political vulnerability and conflict. Technical expertise about complex subjects such as economics, public health, engineering, and military strategy can improve policy outcomes by providing more accurate information about cause and effect relationships and by identifying policy options that non-experts might miss. But expertise also creates dependencies on specialists who may have their own interests and biases that conflict with broader public purposes. And it may undermine democratic legitimacy when expert recommendations conflict with popular preferences. The challenge for political leaders involves harnessing expert knowledge effectively while maintaining democratic accountability and avoiding capture by narrow technical perspectives that ignore important political and social considerations. This requires institutional arrangements that provide access to expert advice while preserving political authority to make final decisions based on broader considerations than technical expertise alone can provide. Modern examples include scientific advisory committees, independent regulatory agencies, and various forms of evidence-based policy-making that attempt to combine expert knowledge with democratic governance. The limitations of theoretical knowledge in political contexts reflect fundamental differences between the controlled environments where theories are developed and tested and the complex, dynamic environments where political decisions must be made. Theoretical models necessarily simplify reality to make analysis possible, but political situations often involve precisely the kinds of complexity, uncertainty, and value conflicts that theoretical simplification eliminates. Meanwhile, theoretical knowledge often focuses on optimal solutions under ideal conditions rather than on workable solutions under existing constraints and with available resources. This can create gaps between theoretical recommendations and practical possibilities that make purely academic approaches to policy problems ineffective or counterproductive. Effective political leadership requires the ability to translate theoretical insights into practical strategies while adapting to circumstances that theoretical models cannot fully anticipate or control. This translation process requires different skills than those needed for theoretical analysis, including political judgment, negotiation ability, and sensitivity to implementation challenges that academic training may not provide. The relationship between intellectual independence and political effectiveness creates ongoing tensions for scholars, policy experts, and other knowledge producers who wish to influence political decisions while maintaining their intellectual integrity. Intellectual work requires freedom to pursue questions wherever they lead and to reach conclusions based on evidence and logic rather than on political convenience or popular opinion. But political effectiveness often requires adapting intellectual conclusions to political realities, building coalitions among groups with different interests and values, and accepting compromise solutions that fall short of intellectually optimal outcomes. Scholars who maintain complete intellectual independence may produce work that is intellectually valuable but politically irrelevant, while those who adapt their work too extensively to political requirements may compromise their intellectual credibility and long-term effectiveness. Finding appropriate balances between intellectual independence and political engagement requires sophisticated understanding of both intellectual and political processes, as well as clear thinking about the different types of contributions that intellectual work can make to political life. Modern examples include the role of think tanks in policy making, the relationship between universities and government agencies, and various forms of public intellectuals who attempt to bridge academic and political worlds. The strategic dimensions of knowledge in political competition reveal how information and expertise can become weapons in political conflicts, while also serving their traditional functions of improving understanding and decision-making. Political actors may commission research, cite studies, and invoke expert authority not because they are genuinely seeking better information, but because doing so provides tactical advantages in political debates. This instrumental use of knowledge can distort both research processes and political discussions by creating incentives for producing conclusions that serve political purposes rather than advancing genuine understanding. Meanwhile, opponents may attack research credibility, question expert motives, or promote alternative experts who reach different conclusions, regardless of the actual quality of research or expertise involved. These dynamics can undermine public trust in expertise, while also reducing the actual utility of research and analysis for improving policy making. The challenge involves developing institutional arrangements that protect the integrity of research and analysis while allowing their insights to influence political processes in constructive ways. This might involve independent research institutions, transparent peer review processes, and various forms of science communication that help non-experts evaluate competing knowledge claims more effectively. The goal is not to insulate knowledge production completely from political influence, which would reduce its relevance for practical problems, but rather to ensure that political considerations enhance rather than distort the knowledge production process. Part 20. Machiavelli's Legacy and the Future of Political Realism. The enduring influence of Machiavellian political analysis extends far beyond the specific historical circumstances that shaped his original insights to provide a framework for understanding political dynamics that continues to evolve and adapt to new challenges facing contemporary societies. His fundamental contribution involves not any particular policy recommendation or institutional design, but rather a methodological approach to political analysis that prioritizes empirical observation over theoretical assumption and practical effectiveness over moral idealism. This methodological legacy has influenced fields ranging from international relations theory to organizational psychology to strategic management, creating intellectual tools that remain relevant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. But his legacy also includes unresolved tensions and ongoing debates about the relationship between political effectiveness and moral legitimacy that continue to challenge democratic societies around the world. Understanding this legacy becomes crucial for anyone seeking to apply Machiavellian insights to contemporary political challenges while avoiding the dangers of crude manipulation or amoral pragmatism that have sometimes been associated with his approach. The future development of political realism must address both the continuing relevance and the inherent limitations of Machiavellian analysis in contexts that he could not have anticipated but that share fundamental characteristics with the political environments he studied. Strategized comprehensive conclusion for final analytical section. This is the final part. So I need to make sure it provides a comprehensive conclusion that ties together all the major themes while also looking forward to contemporary applications and future developments. Let me structure this to cover the methodological legacy and core insights, contemporary applications and relevance, unresolved tensions and criticisms, future developments and adaptations, final assessment of the enduring significance I need to maintain the same depth, format, and pause gap structure while providing a satisfying conclusion to the entire analysis. The methodological revolution that Machiavelli initiated continues to shape how scholars and practitioners approach political analysis by insisting on the priority of empirical observation over theoretical elegance or moral wishful thinking. His commitment to studying politics as it actually operates, rather than as we wish it would operate, has become the foundation for modern social science methodology across multiple disciplines. This empirical approach generates insights that often challenge conventional wisdom and comfortable assumptions about human nature, institutional effectiveness, and the possibilities for political reform. But it also provides more reliable guidance for practical action, because it begins with accurate understanding of existing conditions rather than with idealized assumptions about how people and institutions should behave. The methodological legacy includes not just specific analytical techniques, but also intellectual attitudes of skepticism toward official explanations, sensitivity to unintended consequences, and recognition that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. These intellectual attitudes remain essential for effective political analysis in any historical period, though their specific applications must adapt to changing technological, social, and institutional circumstances. The contemporary relevance of Machiavellian analysis becomes apparent when examining current challenges facing democratic societies, international organizations, and various forms of institutional reform around the world. His insights about the tension between expert knowledge and popular opinion help explain contemporary debates about technocratic governance, scientific advice in policy-making, and the role of expertise in democratic decision-making. His analysis of the relationship between economic inequality and political stability provides framework for understanding current concerns about democratic consolidation, populist movements, and the political impact of globalization. His examination of conspiracy dynamics and elite competition offers insights into contemporary challenges ranging from political polarization to corporate governance to the management of international alliances. His treatment of fortune and contingency provides resources for thinking about risk management, strategic planning, and institutional resilience in an era of rapid technological change and global uncertainty. Perhaps most importantly, his focus on the practical requirements for effective governance remains relevant for anyone involved in organizational leadership, policy implementation, or institutional design, in contexts where good intentions must be translated into concrete results. The unresolved tensions in Machiavellian political philosophy reflect deeper philosophical problems about the relationship between power and justice that cannot be solved through better theoretical analysis but require ongoing practical judgment in specific circumstances. His separation of political effectiveness from traditional moral categories creates intellectual space for realistic analysis of power dynamics. But it also raises questions about whether purely instrumental approaches to politics can provide adequate guidance for human flourishing and social cooperation. His emphasis on adaptability and contextual judgment provides flexibility for responding to changing circumstances. But it may also undermine the consistency and predictability that legal institutions and social cooperation require. His focus on elite leadership and institutional design may neglect important democratic values about popular participation and political equality that have become central to contemporary political legitimacy. These tensions cannot be resolved through theoretical argument alone because they reflect genuine conflicts between important values that cannot be perfectly reconciled in practice. The value of Machiavellian analysis lies not in providing final answers to these moral and political questions, but rather in clarifying the trade-offs involved and in providing analytical tools for making difficult decisions when different values conflict with each other. The future development of political realism must address new challenges created by technological innovation, global integration, and environmental change that alter traditional relationships between territory and political authority, individual and collective action, and national and international governance. Digital technologies create new possibilities for political communication, organization, and control that change how political power operates while also creating new vulnerabilities and dependencies that traditional political analysis did not anticipate. Global economic integration creates interdependencies between political systems that limit the autonomy of individual states, while also creating new opportunities for cooperation and coordination across traditional political boundaries. Environmental challenges, such as climate change, require forms of long-term planning and international cooperation that may exceed the capabilities of existing political institutions, while also creating new sources of conflict and instability. Artificial intelligence and automation technologies may alter fundamental assumptions about human agency, economic organization and social cooperation that underlie traditional political theory. Addressing these challenges requires extending Machiavellian analytical methods to new domains while adapting traditional insights about power, leadership and institutional design to circumstances that previous generations could not have imagined. The enduring significance of Machiavellian political philosophy lies not in its specific recommendations about princely behavior or republican institutions, but rather in its intellectual framework for thinking clearly about political problems, without allowing moral idealism or theoretical elegance to obscure practical realities. This framework remains valuable because the fundamental challenges of political life continue to involve the same basic tensions between individual interests and collective purposes, between moral principles and practical necessities, between short-term pressures and long-term requirements that Machiavelli identified in his historical context. Human nature has not fundamentally changed since the 16th century, which means that his psychological insights about motivation, leadership and group behavior continue to provide valuable guidance for contemporary political analysis. Meanwhile, the basic structural features of political life, including the need for effective institutions, the management of conflict and cooperation, and the relationship between domestic and international affairs, continue to create similar challenges across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The goal is not to apply Machiavellian conclusions mechanically to contemporary problems, but rather to use his analytical approach to develop new insights appropriate for current circumstances while avoiding the intellectual traps of wishful thinking and moral complacency that he identified as obstacles to effective political action. This requires combining realistic assessment of existing conditions with creative thinking about institutional innovations and strategic possibilities that can address emerging challenges while building on the accumulated wisdom of previous political experience. The man who began as a minor Florentine civil servant created an intellectual revolution that continues to influence how people think about power, leadership and governance 5 centuries after his death. His refusal to accept comfortable illusions about political life opened intellectual space for more effective approaches to the persistent challenges of human cooperation and social organization. But his insights come with responsibilities as well as opportunities, since realistic understanding of political dynamics can be used for both constructive and destructive purposes, depending on the values and objectives of those who apply his analytical methods. The ultimate test of Machiavellian political wisdom lies not in its theoretical elegance or moral purity, but in its capacity to help people build institutions and practices that serve human flourishing while acknowledging the limitations and complexities that make such achievements difficult and fragile. In a world where good intentions remain common, but effective action remains rare, his commitment to understanding politics as it actually operates, rather than as we wish it would operate, continues to provide essential resources for anyone seeking to make constructive contributions to political life. The legacy lives on wherever people refuse to mistake moral posturing for political effectiveness, wherever they insist on empirical evidence rather than theoretical assumption, and wherever they accept the difficult responsibilities of leadership while working to expand human possibilities for cooperation and justice.